Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring murder plots. Birthday Present by Arnold Marmor. Imitation of Death by Lester Del Rey. Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. The Star Beast by Damon Knight. Formula for Murder by Milton A. Rothman. Birthday Present by Arnold Marmor, originally published in Imitation Stories of Science and Fantasy, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Diane's husband spent most of his time on Mars, and I spent most of mine with Diane. It was a nice arrangement, much too nice to last. "It's tonight or never," Diane said. "Yes," I said. I watched her as she walked back and forth across my bedroom floor. She had on a sheer plasto dress that clung to her round white breasts and full milky thighs. "I'm picking you up at the Spaceway," she said. "We're supposed to go dining and dancing tonight." She stopped pacing. "It's my birthday. I'm 30 today." And I was 24 and in love. 6 years between us. So what? I didn't give a damn. I wanted to marry her, to live with her. "I'm 30, she said again. "Do you mind?" "I know your age. Why bring it up?" "Someday you'll find out you married an old woman, if we ever do marry." "Stop it." I got off the bed, went to her. "Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." "Do you love me?" She looked up at me. "You know I do." "Say it." "I love you." "Never stop saying that." She put up her face and I kissed her. A long, hard kiss. She broke away. "You'll be back in the racer. Just crouch low. As soon as we're away from the Spaceway, you hit him with a wrench. It has to be quick and sure. Then we can carry him up to the apartment and drop him out the window." I shuddered a little as she talked. She was so calm about the whole thing. "You'll have plenty of time to get out. It'll be listed as a suicide. He's been sick for a long time. His doctor will testify to that. He was so sick and worried he jumped to his death." She stared at me hard. "Is it all clear?" "Yes." I looked at her. Her long blonde hair, her oval face, the slim white column that was her throat. "It's all clear, like glass." I poured myself a drink. I needed it. I was going to need a lot more. "We won't be able to see each other for a long time," she said. She watched me drink. "We don't want to give our friends something to talk about." "I won't like not seeing you." She patted my face. I put down my drink, caged her slender hand in mine, and kissed her wrist. I saw the light blue veins crisscrossing under the delicate skin. I brought her close to me. I kissed her warm lips. "Baby," I breathed. "Diane, baby." "Paul, listen to me. We haven't much time." "All right, sweet." I kissed her again. "Come on, we can't afford to get there late." I crouched low in the back of the racer. I heard the street noises, the gab of the night crowds, the not-so-mild cursings of the taxi-jet drivers. It all seemed so unreal. Back there on my haunches, a wrench gripped tight in my sweaty hand. I was going to kill a man I knew, a man I respected. And for a woman, all for a woman. I thought about getting up and telling Diane to go to hell and to get herself another stooge. I thought about a lot of things. Then I thought of Diane, her sweet white body, the way she sighed when I kissed her hard, and I knew I was going to go through with it. The racer stopped. Its jets cut off. I heard the hum as the door opened and she got out. This was it. I sweated. It dripped down in an endless stream. The seconds went by, then the minutes. They got in, and the door hummed shut, and I heard their laughter blending together. They settled back, and the jets roared. The racer woke up to a new life, and it shot away. How was the trip? I heard Diane asking. Cold, and I'm not sure it was worth it. Those Martians drive a hard bargain. He coughed. Diane, you're not too set on going out tonight, are you? Why? She asked. I thought how nice it would be if we spent the evening at home. Just as you say, Roger. You don't care? Of course not. She was so calm, so damn calm. There would never be another like Diane. You won't regret it, Roger promised. My, but this boulevard is deserted, she said. Not a soul in sight. That was for my benefit. It was my cue. I sat up silently. He saw me then in the rear-view mirror. What the hell? He started to turn. My arm sprang alive, the wrench thudded against his skull. A half-cry spilled from his lips, then his head fell forward on his chest. Hit him again, Diane urged. But, do as I say. I hit him again, hard. It was done. I settled back. The wrench was still in my hand. I looked at it, then let it fall. Are you all right? Diane asked. Yes, I said. Why shouldn't I be? You're not going to be sick, are you? No, you think I'm a kid? You did it for an old woman. Stop it. Today is my birthday, don't you know? I'm 30. Shut up. I wonder what he got for my birthday. Please. I'm sorry, really I am. I feel like talking. If I don't, I think I'd scream. So I let her talk. I didn't answer her. She babbled away like she was crazy. She kept it up till we got to their apartment. Diane got out first and made sure the way was clear. We'll use the back stairs, she said when she got back. We both can manage him. It was dark and it was late, and we didn't see anybody. We went through the service entrance. It was too heavy a load for me to do it alone. 2 flights up. Diane helped me with him. I breathed easier when we were in the marble hall outside the apartment. She quickly unlocked the heavy plastic door, and we got him inside. She fumbled for the inner lighting switch. Happy birthday! They shouted. Now I knew why Roger had wanted to spend the evening at home. We stood there, Diane and myself, with Roger between us. Then they stopped shouting and stared at us. I thought they would never stop staring. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Imitation of Death by Lester Del Rey, originally published in Future combined with Science Fiction Stories, May and June 1950. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Max Flay's heavy jowls relaxed, and he chuckled without humour as he examined the knots that bound the man at his feet. Quite impersonally, he planted the toe of his boot in Curtis's ribs, listened to the muffled grunt of pain, and decided that the gag was effective. For once, Slim had done a good job, and there was nothing wrong. It was probably unnecessary anyway, but there could be no bungling when the future of the Plutarchy was at stake. Incompetence had cost them an empire once, and there would be no third opportunity. The stupid democracy that had called themselves a world union had colonized the planets and ruled them without plan. And when Mars, Venus, and the Jovian worlds had revolted and set up a planet council, all that Earth could do was to come crawling to it, begging polite permission to join what they should have owned. But that had been before practical realists had kicked out the dreamers and set up the Plutarchy under an iron discipline that could implement its plans. Now they were heading back toward their lost empire, colonizing the asteroids and establishing claims that gave them a rough rule over the outlaws who had retreated there. With a council softened up by years of cautious propaganda, they were in a position to ask and receive a mandate over the scattered planetoids. It was the opening wedge, and all they needed. Once the asteroids could be given spurious independence to seek a council seat, they would be ready to strike at the Jovian worlds. With proper incidents, propaganda, and quislings, plus the planetoids to separate Jupiter from Mars, there could be no question of the outcome. Earth would gain a majority of these votes, and the Council would be the basis of a new and greater plutarchy. Flay gave the bound body of Curtis another careless kick, and went forward to the cabin, where the lanky form of his companion was hunched downwardly over the controls of the little spacecraft. "How's it going, Slim?" "So-so." Slim ejected a green stream of narcotic juice and grinned sourly. "But I still say we've been crowding our luck too hard." "Rot. Lay out the right moves, cover all possibilities, outmaneuver your enemies, and you don't need luck. Ever played chess?" "Nope, can't say I did. Played the horses on Mars, though. Time we hissed on Ephemeron. One do. After I bought my lucky ghost charm. Been in the chips ever since." Slim's grin widened, but his face remained stubbornly unconvinced. Flay chuckled. If the planetoid outlaws depended on magic, while the council visionaries spouted sentimental twaddle, so much the better for the realists. "Charms don't work in politics, Slim. We have to anticipate resistance, and you saw what happened to our fine Martian Councillor Curtis when he decided to expose us and ruin the mandate." "Yeah." Slim's yellow teeth chewed thoughtfully on his cud. "Suppose he'd stood on Mars, though. We'd have dropped hints of just the information he needed on Ceres and trapped him there, as we did. Checkmate. Or check out. So when he don't come back, they smell a rat. And I ain't planning on being around to chew rat poison. My grandpappy killed a councillor once. Poor grandpappy. Hey, there's the rock." There was no outward sign of life on the barren little planetoid, but as the ship came to a grinding stop in a narrow gorge, a concealing shield snapped over them, and a crudely painted sign blazed out in phosphorescent gaudiness on one rocky wall. "Simulacra Limited, Jeremiah Greek Proprietor." A line in Greek characters. "Specialist," another line in Greek characters. Flay came out of the lock first, and paused while he waited for Slim to shoulder the tarpaulin-covered Curtis and follow. He grinned and pointed at the Greek characters in the sign. "Magician and wonder-worker. Specialist in imitation and mockery," he translated. "I looked it up on Mars, so don't go thinking it's some kind of spell. Now if the old fool will open up." Max remembered his own preconceptions of Greeks' process, pictured various impressive-looking apparatus, which included a large tube through which some sort of lightning zigzagged, and a beautiful woman taking form from a stream of transmuted elements streaming from the top. It was nothing like such cinematic legerdemain, of course. "Why ain't English good enough for him?" complained Slim. "I don't go for that magic stuff, Max. We been—" But the Sigma was already swinging back on his tips to reveal a passage through the rock. A little shriveled man in tattered shorts and thick-lensed glasses stood motioning them in impatiently, and the door closed silently when they obeyed his summons. They headed down a side passage toward a ramp and the sound of busy humming. Greek threw open a door and pointed to a table where the duplicate of Councillor Curtis lay, with a duplicate Jeremiah Greek fussing over it and humming through his nose. The guide dropped to a bench and began removing his chest and inserting a fresh power pack between two terminals. Slim's mouth dropped open, and his burden slipped from his back to the floor with a sodden thump, while he stared from one Greek to the other, and back to the first. His fingers were stretched in the ancient sign of the horns as he watched the changing of accumulators, and his voice was hoarse and uncertain. "A damned robot!" "Not a robot, a simulacrum," denied the owl-eyed man who must have been the original of the metal creature. "I'm a mimicist, not a creator. A robot has independent life, but that's only a limited copy of my memories and habits, like this phony Curtis. And those tapes you brought me, Flay, they stink." He gestured toward the spools of the marvelous wire that could record electromagnetic waves of any type of frequency up to several million megacycles. In one corner, a stereo player was running one off, but the vision screen was fuzzy,
and the voice part was a mass of gibberish. Flay scowled at it and turned back suspiciously to Greek. "Sure you know how to use them? Those were made by a fool who had a shield leak in his scanner. Only a few were any good. I was using pancyclic tape before you ever saw a stereo record. Where do you think I impressed my simulacrum's memory? On a real brain? It takes miles of tape to feed the selectrons. I did the best I could, but... Here, take a look." He reached into the false Curtis's mouth and did something that made the figure sit up suddenly. Max went over and muttered into the thing's ear, but after the first few answers it lapsed into sullen silence, and he swung back toward Greek. "I told you Curtis had to be perfect. This wouldn't fool a Jovian." "And I told you I wasn't Jehovah. I specialize in mechanical imitations," Greek answered shortly. "Bum tape, bum simulacrum. If you brought me some decent reels, I'll see what I can do, though." Flay grunted and yanked the tarpaulin off the real Curtis. At the sight, new interest appeared on Greek's face, and he came over to examine the counsellor, but stopped after a cursory look had shown that the man was still alive. He nodded. "That's more like it, Flay. I'll set up an encephalograph and ideoform analyzer and record directly off his mind. It's better than feeding impressions from tape anyway, though I always use an editing circuit before. Okay, you'll get something of his own mother would swear was perfect." "When?" "Depends. Narrowband analysis would take a couple weeks, but it'd be permanent. If I run an all-wave impressor in, the tapes will be barely affected. I can do it in 10-12 hours, but your simulacrum will begin to fade in a week and wash out completely in a month." "Suits me," Flay decided. "We don't need him more than a few days. Any place where Slim and I can catch up on our sleep while you finish." Greeks' double came to life at a signal, and led them down a series of rock corridors to a room that lacked nothing in comfort, then went silently out and left them alone. To Flay's relief, Slim tested the bed in sour displeasure, pulled a blanket off, and rolled up on the floor, leaving the flotation mattress unoccupied. He had as little use for such luxuries as his boss had for his presence in the same bed. Max climbed in and adjusted the speed dial and perfect comfort with a relaxed grunt of pleasure. He had no intention of sleeping, though, while things that concerned him were going on. 3 hours later he heaved out and slipped silently down the rocky halls on sponge rubber slippers. But his training had covered the stupidity of spy stereos. There was nothing stealthy about his entry into the laboratory. Greek looked up from a maze of wires and gadget with faint surprise but no suspicion. "Couldn't sleep," Flay volunteered apologetically. "I was wondering if you had any barbiturates." A few minutes later he took the tablet from Greek's double and turned back down the hallway with a muttered thanks. He had learned all he wanted to know. Both Greeks and Curtises were present and accounted for where they belonged, and the mimicist was busy about his work. There was no funny business involved. Actually, he had expected none, but it never did any harm to make sure of such things when dealing with men who were outside the law of either the Plutarchy or the Council. Slim was snoring and kicking about on the floor when he returned, and he grinned as he plopped back onto the mattress. The outlaws were useful enough now, but once Earth took over the mandate, something would have to be done about them. Too many were the wrong sort to fit into the Plutarchy. Flay stretched with a self-satisfied yawn and slipped into well-earned sleep. Greek's simulacrum wakened them in the morning and led them back to the laboratory, where the scientist was waiting beside the imitation Curtis. The real counsellor must have been drugged, for he lay unconscious on one of the tables. Flay wasted only a casual glance at him, and then turned to the new simulacrum as Greek flipped it on. This time his tests were longer, and there were no sullen silences from the imitation. His response was quick, sure, and completely correct. The real Curtis could have done no better, and Flay stepped back at last and nodded his approval. He demanded a perfect simulacrum, and it had been delivered. "You're sure it has a good, strong desire to live?" he asked briefly as he fished into his bag for the little prepared relay that was ready. Greek smiled faintly. "They all have that. They couldn't pass as normal men without it. And if your dimensions were correct, you should have no trouble installing your relay." He slipped aside the blouse to reveal a small cavity in the back of the simulacrum, with a bundle of little wires which Flay hooked into the relay. It slipped in and locked firmly. Greek unclipped the tiny switch from inside the machine's mouth. The animation within the simulacrum disappeared at once, to snap back again as a switch on Flea's bag was pressed. A little circle of the pancyclic strip moved over a scanner inside the bag, sending out a complex wave, while a receiver in the simulacrum's back responded by closing the relay. Then the animation was cut off again, and came back at once on a second pressure of the switch. "Attempted removal of the relay will destroy all circuits, just as you ordered," Greek assured the operative. "Well?" Flay's face mirrored complete satisfaction. "You'll get the fire emeralds, as promised." He reached into the bag and came out with a little bundle. A grin stretched across his face. It stayed there while Greek moved forward quickly, to stagger back with a chopped-off scream as the slugs poured into his face and exploded his head into a mangled mess of blood and grey tissue. For a second, the Greek double moved forward, but it turned with a shriek and went down the hall at a clumsy run as Flay ripped the smoking gun from the package. He let it go. Curtis's head dissolved under a second series of slugs, and only the simulacrum of the consular was left with the laboratory with the two men. Slim closed his mouth slowly and reached for his green narcotic, but he made no protest. The other moved about, gathering up combustibles and stacking them in a corner, then setting fire to the pile. "Which take care of almost everything, Slim," Flade said calmly. They headed out and down the hall toward the ship, with the Imitation Curtis moving quietly along behind. Another slug from the gun destroyed the lock on the big Sigma, and they pushed through, out into the rocky gorge. Nothing left to chance, and a perfect red herring to cover up Curtis' disappearance. Slim ducked into the lock and went forward to the controls. "Uh-huh. Grandpappy'd sure have admired you, Max. Used to look just the same when he drilled somebody he didn't like. All set for takeoff?" "Forgetting anything, Slim?" The outlaw looked up in puzzled surprise, while Flay shook his head and went over to the receiver. There was no sense in trying to teach the fool anything, apparently, but at least he might have learned elementary caution from his mode of life. The Plutarch operative ripped out the tape from the illegal all-wave recorder and slipped it into a playback slot, while slow comprehension crossed the other's face. But everything was in order, with the usual hash of faint signals on various frequencies. There were no signs of a strong response, such as would have been made by any attempt on Greek's part to double-cross him with a call to the outside. He set the receiver to record, and went toward the rear cabin and the simulacrum, while the ship blasted off and headed towards Mars. The false Curtis was already at a table, and groping through a bag of notes the original counselor had carried. It looked up as Flay come in, grimaced, and went on organizing the paper before it. The operative dropped to a chair with his familiar humorless chuckle. "You realize your life is dependent on obedience, Curtis?" "Would I have let you kill myself otherwise?" the thing asked grimly. "Leave that control gadget of yours where I can get it, and you'll feel the difference between my hands and mere flesh ones. But meantime, I'll cooperate, since I have no choice. I suppose you intend helping with my speech before the council." Flay's appreciation for the peculiar genius of Greek went up several points as he assented tersely. The thing was perfect, or so nearly so that it seemed to consider itself the real man. There would be no trouble on that score. As for the control bag, he had no intention of letting that out of his hands until the simulacrum was turned off. It gestured toward the notes with a motion peculiar to Curtis. "You'd only ruin anything you edited, Flay. I'm perfectly capable of writing the thing myself, and it'll sound like me. But if I'm going to give you a clean sheet and not make the whole council suspicious, I'll need more information than I have. I must have the whole picture, so I can take care of all objections without running counter to what some other councillors may know already. So, I think you'd better learn to address me as Councillor Curtis." "Quite so, Councillor," Flay agreed, and this time the amusement in his laugh was genuine. "Now, if you'll tell me what you know of our plans and methods, I'll fill in the blanks. But I'll want to see that speech when you're finished." It was amazing, the amount of evidence Curtis had managed to accumulate in a brief week, or perhaps much of it had been in his hands before and only needed organizing against what they had let him find on series. It was enough to have ruined all hopes of Earth's getting the mandate, and seriously endangering her relations with the Planet Council in addition. Flay made a mental note to press for an investigation of some of the Outland operatives as he began filling in the missing links in the others' information. Curtis took the facts down in a notebook, grim-faced and silent, checked them back, and reached for the typewriter. The first part of the speech he had meant to deliver needed but slight modification, and Flay read it over the simulacrum's shoulder as it operated the machine. Then the going grew tougher, and there were long pauses while the thing considered, revising a word here or changing a paragraph there. It disregarded Flay's suggestions with the same disdain that would have been on the real councillor's face, and the operative began to realize that it was justified. When it came to writing speeches, he was only an amateur, and this was professional work. He was beginning to regret that the thing could have had a life of only from a week to 10 days when it finished. Earth could have used such a propagandist, particularly one accepted on the council as Mars's chief representative. Curtis' speeches had always been good, but he had never realized that the man's talents would have been equally good on propaganda. It was hard to believe that this was fiction, as he listened to the calm, assured voice running through it, apparently reciting only the simple truth, and yet colouring every word with some trick of oratory that seemed to make it glow with virtue and integrity. "Perfect," he commented when it was finished. He cut off the relay signal, watched the simulacrum slip to the floor, and went forward to the control cabin with a full measure of satisfaction. Earth could not fail. And already the red disk of Mars was large and close on the viewplate. Flay hadn't realized the time the writing of the speech had taken, but he did not regret a second of it as Slim began nursing the ship down through the thin atmosphere toward the solar center. The taste of coming victory was strong in Max Flay as he waited outside the Martian house the next day, but Slim was still glum and morose. Part of that was probably due to his orders to stay out of the usual outlaw haunts on the planet, where the police might have picked him up and ruined the whole plan. The rest, Flay decided, was just his natural fear of what he could not understand. The outlaw was grumbling and turning his lucky ghost charm over and over in his palms. "Leaving the thing run around this way. We've been lucky, Max, but 'tain't reasonable to figure it'll hold. You should have let me tail him." "Sure, Slim. People expect him to go around with you at his heels, no doubt." Flay spat dango seeds out of the open car window and took another bite of the cool fruit before going on. "We have to let him circulate. No councillor just back from a 2-week trip would hole up before his meeting, when he had instructions to pick up any last-minute details piling in. Besides, we're not dealing with Curtis now, but with a machine, and it knows who its master is. The minute I cut the relay, or it gets 10 miles away from me, no life." He spotted the simulacrum coming down the steps and jumped out to open the car door. Slim grunted dourly, pulling his chauffeur's cap further down his forehead. But he took the curt order from Curtis with no other protests and headed the big car toward the council chambers. The councillor passed over 2 slips of elaborate pasteboard and leaned back against the sheet. "Passes for the 2 of you. Are you sure Slim knows what he's to do?" There was a disgusted sound from the front, but Flay ignored it. "He'd better. We've been over it often enough, but go ahead and make sure." The simulacrum ticked off the points with incisive authority. The council chamber was radiation-proof, and since Curtis would not be trusted with a relay signal, the success of the whole thing depended on Slim's behavior. Max had secured a duplicate of his signal generator which the outlaw was to use outside the assembly, while Flay went inside with his and waited. The operative had developed complete confidence in the ability of the false Curtis, and he was sure of his own part. It was all up to Slim. There was no reason for him to fail, and he had always taken orders well enough before. Actually, it all went off with perfect smoothness. The guards passed him in after a careful scrutiny of his permit, and he carried the briefcase that held the generator up to the gallery and turned it on. Seconds later, the simulacrum came through the big doorway with only a slight flicker of uncertainty as the anti-radiation shield touched him, and he passed from one generator to the other. Curtis walked along the aisle with the proper confidence and attention to his friends, presented his credentials for the purely perfunctory examination, and turned off into one of the little council rooms. 2 of the other Martian councillors followed him, and passed out of Flay's field of view, but he was not worried about that. Slim came slouching down the gallery stairs and dropped into a seat beside the operative, putting the duplicate generator between his feet. "Satisfied?" "Perfect," Flay assured him. They would reverse it going out. After that, Cursed would announce that he was leaving on a long trip to Ganymede, and they would be able to dispose of the simulacrum without any parts left to show what he was. Then Curtis came back into the main chamber. Apparently the council had been waiting for his return, for the sergeant-at-arms waved for order, and the meeting began, with almost no preliminaries. Earth brought up the subject of the mandate, and the head of the Venus Council began to come to his feet. But Curtis was up first, and the chair recognized him. Flay relaxed completely as the familiar words of the speech began to come to him, while the Venusians glanced about in surprise, and then began to listen. A moment later they were under the sway of his oratory. The single speech should do it, since the question had been tentatively decided in favor of Earth at their last meeting, pending Curtis's investigation. By night, the mandate should be a fait accompli, and Earth could begin moving out her mercenary legions in the squat mining freighters. Flay had a pretty good idea of who would lead them. He'd been in line for promotion for some time already, and the Plutarch had dropped hints of the outcome of success. It would be good to leave the dubious position of operative and become the legally recognized governor of the mandate planetoids, to settle down and begin organizing his own private little plans for the Plutarch's job. Slim nudged him with a bony knee, but Flay was too wrapped in his own thoughts to bother until the other seized his elbow and hissed at him. Then he came out of his daydreams. Something was going on. The councillors were paying too careful attention, and the Earth delegation didn't look right. In a second his mind was back on the speech, and the words came to a chilling focus in the air. "Found the organization inconceivably complex, and yet the basic pattern is old as the barbarism that prompted it. Gentlemen, I have only my word as evidence now, but I can name names and give exact locations that will enable our planetary police to confirm every word of it before night falls on this meeting. The Plutarch of Earth, on the 20th of April, 42 years ago, gave the following orders, which I quote." Flay grabbed for Slim's generator and yanked the button savagely, but still the damning words went on, detail piling on exact detail, while Secret Servicemen moved forward to cut the speaker off from the Earth delegates. Their rudeness was an open declaration that Earth was immediately severed from the Council. Max ripped out the generator, crushing the delicate tubes in his hands. He was stamping on his own device at the same time, but the voice went on unchecked. Down on the floor, Curtis looked upwards without pausing in his detailed list of evidence, found the operative's eye and grinned. Then he resumed his normal gravity and went on. Slim's hands were trembling and fumbling over his charm. Flay practically carried him over to the aisle and dragged him along as he made his way up the infinite distance to the gallery door. Every step was made with the expectation of a shouted order from Curtis that would send the big explosive slugs tearing through him. But it did not come. Instead, there was only the quiet continuance of the speech, and Slim's hoarse prayers to the ghosts of the charm to save them. Surprisingly, the doors opened in the hands of the courteous guards, and the hall was before them, with no police in sight. Max cut Slim's babbled relief off with a crisp whisper. "We're not out of it, you fool. 10 to 1, it's cat and mouse, with us the losers. But if we're going to make use of the 10th chance, shut up, walk, damn it, and grin." There was another flight of stairs leading down, a long hall, and a second door that opened promptly and politely as they neared it. Then the main steps led down to the street. It was impossible that the simulacrum could have given no orders for their arrest, as impossible as the relay could be tampered with. But the big car waited at the curb, and there still no police. Reaction left Slim drooling narcotic juice over the hands that were caressing and kissing the charm. Flay yanked him savagely into the car and gunned the electros. It went tearing out into the street under full power, while a wild yell of despair ripped out of the outlaw's throat. "My ghost charm!" He was pawing frantically at the door lock, with his face swiveled around toward the bright receding twinkle of the metal piece on the sidewalk behind. "Max! Max!" "Shut up and stay put. There must be 100 more of those things you can buy if we get out of this." Flay freed a hand and forced the cringing fool back into the seat, where he relaxed woodenly, terror fading out to sullen despair that gradually mingled with doubt. "Then let's get out of quick, Max. Once we hit Earth, I know a guy's got another. It ain't as good a ghost with it as mine, but it ain't no fake, neither. You got to give me enough to get it, Max." Flay hid his thin grin from the other. They'd need more than a ghost charm or even planning if they ever went to Earth. He'd seen what happened to failures there, and he knew that it would be better to walk into the nearest planet police bureau. But he reached over soothingly and patted the outlaw's shoulder. "Sure, Slim. We'll get you another, maybe before we leave here." It shouldn't be hard to find one of the charm peddlers and dope up a story. There was a place on Venus where they could hide, once Slim worked up his nerve to pilot them there, and provided that their luck held long enough to keep the police from impounding the little craft. But the hideout would take money, and that had to come first. Planning took care of that. He'd always been careful to avoid tying his personal fortune up in the Earth operative strongholds. He swung the car around a corner, glanced up at a jeweller's sign, and cursed without slowing down. The red light was on, warning that it had been raided. One of his secret quarters gone. He stopped obediently for a through highway, and roared on. But the second was no better. There was sweat on his forehead, and his hands were slippery with it when he headed out Mars Center Canal into the suburbs. Damn Curtis! It was impossible for him to have found the hideout, or should have been. But there was no warning light in the window of the third and last place. The lawyer's faded sign swung into the thin wind, and everything was serenely peaceful. Flay jerked Slim out of the car, set his automatic chauffeur, and let it go rolling off. Then he moved up the steps with the outlaw at his heels, listened cautiously at the door, and nodded. The steady click of a typewriter indicated that the scrawny little secretary was doing the routine office work, and Sammy must have been undisturbed. He opened the door eagerly to a louder clicking from the typewriter. Above it, Curtis looked up with an assured smile and waved the grandfather of all hand weapons at him in genial greeting. "Come in, Max," he said cordially. "Like my doubles of speech?" Slim's trembling hand fumbled out automatically in the sign of the horns. His blanched mouth worked furiously, but the words refused to come until Curtis turned to him, then jerked back, waving his fingers. "He couldn't have. We'd have beat him. Max, he's dead. He's a ghost." Flay's hand groped for him, and missed. Another apparition came into the room from the inner office. This one was a shriveled little man, with owl eyes that blinked at them out of thick-lensed spectacles. Jeremiah Greek picked up a pencil with a contented grin, drew it across the bare flesh of his arm, and held the red mark that rose on the skin out toward the outlaw. "In the flesh," he stated. But Slim was no longer listening. Slowly, as if moved by worn-down clockworks, he slid down the wall, and his dead-faced head bent forward to meet the knees that drew upwards. There he stayed, motionless. "If that catatonic return to the fetal position is an all-time record for speed," Curtis commented with quiet interest. "Sit down, Max. You seem to have overestimated your companion's moral fibre and underestimated your opponent's. Never count on luck. It takes planning to get anywhere in this universe. By the way, Jeremiah Greek is the original inventor of pancyclic tape. You should have checked up on him before you trusted him, and found out the way your Plutarchy gypped him out of his invention. He wasn't the sort of man who'd cooperate very well with Earth. In fact, he was the sort you could and would fake a tape for your recorder to cover up the call they put in under my code to the Martian Council." Flay moved toward the chair as the gun commanded, only half conscious of the words. He sank into a sitting position, his mind churning savagely and getting nowhere. "Play along. Keep your eyes open. If you let the other guy make the moves, he'll slip up somewhere." It was basic training to operatives, though there was uncertainty in even that logic now. But there was nothing else to do. Greek picked up the account. "With a promise of secrecy from Councillor Curtis, and a chance to do legitimate research here, I felt quite free to drop my very doubtful loyalty to my native planet, Mr. Flay. Those 2 simulacra you shot were crude, and the brain and blood imitation was quite poor, I thought. But fortunately, you didn't investigate thoroughly." "I didn't think the relay control could fail, so you simply let the simulacrum collapse and took its place?" Flay was forcing himself to casualness, while his brain hashed over all the rules for upsetting a trap. But it returned inevitably to the basic need of stalling for time and keeping them talking. "Not at all," Curtis corrected them. "We were late returning, so they simply used an all-wave receiver to record your control signal on pancyclic tape, inserting it into a generator, and the simulacrum had his freedom in his pocket 2 minutes after you turned on your control in the council chamber. You really didn't think I'd leave my speech in the middle to chase you when I had a perfectly good double, surely?" Flay's eyes darted to Slim, but there would be no help from that quarter. Not a muscle had moved since the outlaw had collapsed onto the floor. He forced himself to relax deliberately. Relax. As long as he was tensed up in the chair, they'd watch him, but they'd be less cautious if he seemed to abandon hope. And he was younger and faster than they were, in spite of his fat. Greek's amused cackle broke his chain of thought. "So simple a solution, Max. But of course, an involute brain would miss just that. That's fine, relax. And when you start anything, you'll be surprised to find how quickly and efficiently a couple of sentimental visionary fools can shoot. Or do you think, Councillor, that we were really such fools?" "I doubt it," Curtis answered, with the same hard amusement in his voice. "As I see it, a reactionary is simply unable to adapt to new conditions. He's filled with a blind, stubborn dependence on the rude past, and brute force is an admission of that intellectual poverty. Max, you should have studied history better. The addle-pated idealists have a peculiar habit of winning." They stood there, grinning and studying their captive with the one thing in the universe he had never encountered: open contempt. Flay wet his lips, glancing from one to the other, and considering the hopeless distance to the door. And suddenly the beginnings of an idea permeated through the hard knot of fear in his brain. They didn't believe in brute force. They wouldn't kill him without provocation, and they couldn't turn him into the police. He swung back to Curtis, and this time there was a grin on his own lips. "You said you promised Mr. Greek secrecy, Councillor, not immunity, because the old law against making robots is too strong. and simulacra could be considered robots. Well, just how do you figure you can turn me over to the authorities without breaking that promise and having him strung up beside me?" "I never meant to turn you in," Curtis answered. "And you said yourself that brute force was stupid." "Quite true." It was Greek who answered this time. "But the rules of justice sometimes invoke it. The penalty for treason, like that for robotry, is still death, though we've abandoned most other reasons for capital punishment." "Then turn me in, or kill me yourselves, and you'll find that brute force really is stupid on Mars. The police here are the best in the system, which is why I always prefer to do my little jobs elsewhere. You amateurs wouldn't have a chance, well." But he knew that he had them, and the taste of freedom in his mouth was sweet after the fear and hopelessness of their gloating power. He did not wait for an answering nod from them, but turned from his chair in calm assurance and headed for the door. Greek's voice interrupted his exit. "Just a minute, Max. You really should know all your mistakes, and there's one we forgot. Never use a perfect simulacrum. It can't be perfect without thinking exactly like its original. The same mind must operate the same way. Your simulacrum was limited only by the time it could exist, and it knew that, as well as knowing it was useless among real men." "So what?" Flay asked jauntily, and reached for the door. "And so long." Steel hands grabbed him, and a pair of arms with inhuman strength picked him up and turned him around to face the two men. Curtis dropped his gun onto the table with a slow, deliberate motion, holding the struggling operative with a single hand while he stretched the other out to Jeremiah Greek. Then he turned toward the door, dragging the fat body of Flay along without effort. "So when you're found dead in your house, killed by the robot you were having built in some fiendish plot against Councillor Curtis, I don't think the police will worry, beyond seeing that both you and the robot are thoroughly beyond repair." There was bitterness in the voice of the simulacrum, but it was resolute and determined bitterness. "When the real Curtis replaced me in the council chamber, he meant to make a few days of existence as pleasant as possible. But even a limited simulacrum likes to be useful. Come along, Max." Max Flay went along. There was nothing else he could do, as a duplicate of Curtis tossed him into a small car and began driving back toward the town and the house that had been his Martian home and soon would be his tomb. He couldn't even think straight, for his head insisted on dwelling on nonsense. Slim had been right, after all, and his ghost charm had brought him luck, even after he lost it. But for the man who had refused to believe in it, there was no hope for such insane oblivion. There was simply no hope of any kind.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, March 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. If Maudie had only given me the $10,000 to invest in the Martian Development Company, there would have been no reason to kill her. The money would have been more than tripled, and my financial troubles would have been over. But Maudie has always been so unreasonable. Even though she grudgingly admitted that I had been right in the Martian venture, she still had no faith in my business judgment. She was as adamant as ever about parting with the smallest fraction of her vast fortune when I had the opportunity to step in on the ground floor of the Balsavia 6 Mining Corporation. Balsavia 6, in case you don't know, is the newest planet which Earth's spaceships have touched. Everything about Balsavias has been kept strictly hush-hush. Only a handful of people have the slightest concept of the value of the new planet's mineral deposits. It just happened that one of the men in on the top secret was my friend Sylvester, and he was willing to cut me in on a slice of the corporation he was forming for as little as $5,000 on the line. The problem was how to get my hands on that much folding stuff. The answer should have been easy. Maudie, Mrs. Maud Terraine, was one of Earth's wealthiest women, and after all, Maudie was my mother-in-law. The trouble with Maudie was that she was narrow-minded, prejudiced, I might say bigoted. She liked to boast that her family have come from good solid earth stock from the beginning of time, and, while she mingled with the social elite from Venus, she considered Martians crude and refused to entertain guests from what she described as the minor planets. Maudie's second trouble was that she was mean. Although her daughter Isabel and I have been married for 8 years, Maudie never did more than to provide us with a modest allowance. She always felt that I should work, which, after all, is pretty nonsensical when there are so many ways for a man with a little capital to get rich quick. Isabel isn't like Maudie. She's easygoing, pliant, susceptible to flattery, and, on Maudie's death, Isabel would inherit her full fortune. So with a deal like this in the offing, it didn't take any great brain to see that Maudie's rapid demise would remove the single obstacle that stood between myself and untold wealth. The thought of killing Maudie had come often to my mind since my talk with Sylvester, but the available weapons all seemed too crude. I'm a fastidious person, and the idea of shooting or stabbing Maudie was just too vulgar. One of the more subtle poisons might have turned a trick, but certainly nothing as obvious as cyanide or arsenic. As for curare or Bellaston, to be frank, I hadn't the foggiest notion where to lay my hands on them. That's the way things stood when I just happened to stop in front of the window of Melvin Rosie's house of fantastic jewellery in Greenwich Village. I'd passed by the shop many times, but I'd never paused to look in. Of recent years, the village had filled up with all sorts of peculiar people, Martians, Venusians, and the little green men from outer space. One thing I'll have to hand to Maudie. She was right about calling some of these people uncouth. Some of the Galaxians really are riff-raff. Out in front of the store were some long pink flyers advertising the jewellery within. I picked one up idly, for it had just occurred to me that Maudie's birthday was the next day, and that it might not be a bad idea to soften her up with a gift. I looked at the monstrous chunks of jewellery in the display window, rings, bracelets, whatnots, decorated with staring eyes, floating amoebas, and gilded kidneys. Maudie was a pushover for spectacular accoutrements, but this stuff exceeded even her flamboyant taste. Probably I would have walked on by if a couple of lines at the top of the flyer hadn't caught my attention. They were written by some old-time humorist called S.J. Perelman, and he described the jewellery as being like an egg balanced on a cone, an erg balanced on a bone, a hag balanced on a roan. That last part seemed a perfect description of Maudie, a hag balanced on a roan. Almost by instinct I started to climb the crooked stone steps to the shop. The door was open, and the proprietor was standing behind the counter. Other than that, the place was empty. I'd seen Melvin Rosie around before. He was a big brute of a man with a shaggy red beard who sported a dangling jade earring in his left ear. I'd always suspected that Rosie had Martian blood, but I'd never been sure until I glimpsed the little purple flecks in the lines of his palms that are a dead giveaway. Rosie looked up, and his gaze seemed to go right through me. Some of these Martian chaps have an uncanny skill at reading your mind. Rosie's voice was clear and soft, but it had the timbre of some stringed instrument. He said, "A gift, perhaps. For a woman. I nodded, but I almost jumped out of my skin when he added, For your mother-in-law, I should imagine. I'm sure I have just the thing. He showed me a half-dozen pendants and bracelets, but I could see his heart wasn't in it. He was sizing me up, wanting to make sure of me before he offered the piece de resistance. I could feel excitement surging up inside me, even though I had no notion of what it would bring forth. Finally, he went to the rear of the shop and disappeared behind a batik curtain. When he returned, he held in his hand a heart-shaped box of deep napped velvet, royal purple in colour. He laid the box on the glass counter, but his wide palm nearly covered it. His eyes held mine, and his thick lips quirked in a smile that was almost a grimace. He said, I take it you want an extra special gift. I might say a gift for the departing. Even a fatal gift. I gulped and nodded. He raised the box and slipped the catch. The lid rose slowly on coiled hinges, and I was staring at the most delicately wrought necklace I had ever seen. It was long and thin, no wider than a shoestring, and the clasp was a beautifully constructed replica of a snake's head. I looked at the intricate design of the narrow chain with wonder. Certainly it was not a product of Earth, I thought. Nowhere on this planet do we have craftsmen capable of such elaboration of minutiae. Even more striking than the workmanship on the chain was its coloration. It was not gold, as I had first thought, but a metal unknown to me with a flame-like orange glow. My gaze was drawn away from the necklace by Rosie's soft chuckle. It is magnificent, is it not? Yes, I said, but far beyond my means. I had in mind some trifle. Rosie lifted a hand for silence, and again I noticed the purple flecks in the palm. He said, Nothing is too expensive for the woman you hate. I began to stutter a protest, but something in Rosie's expression stopped me. He spoke gently, as though humouring a child. We do not need to discuss price. The necklace will make you a wealthy man. We can settle upon terms then. I don't understand. Ah, but you will, he said, smiling. You do not recognize the metal. There is nothing strange about that. Probably no man of Earth have ever seen it and lived. In Mars it has been given the name of Malutrex, and even here it is both rare and extremely expensive because of its peculiar properties. In all, I doubt if more than a dozen such necklaces were made up. They are called, he stopped to underscore his point, murderers' chains. I think he expected me to ask why, but for some reason my throat was so dry that I couldn't thrust myself to speak. You will recall, he continued slowly, that way back in the 20th century, when the Martians first came to Earth, they were not made exactly welcome. Our first spaceships were fired upon, and many of our people were killed. Our next step was secret infiltration. We landed our ships in deserts and other isolated spots, and unloaded select groups to intermingle with the Earth people, and, because we are a superior race, soon many of our representatives held important posts among the governments of the Earth, especially that of the United States. To these Martians fell the task of breaking down ancient prejudices so that Earth could be opened to unrestricted trade and immigration. This was not easy. The men of Earth still remained hostile to us and, when we were unmasked as Martians, many of us were imprisoned, and some were beaten to death, even executed. The people of Earth were, as a whole, complacent, but they were whipped up to a frenzy by scaremongers and demagogues whose voices it became necessary to silence. Open retaliation would have done more harm than good, and it was then that the Martians found the perfect weapon: Malotrex. This is a metal quite harmless to Martians, for, as you know, our blood has a quite different composition than yours. We can handle Malotrex without the slightest danger. Look." He reached down, coiled the slender chain about his wrist, caught the hook in the tongue-like catch for the delicate clasp, then unloosened it again. He smiled and was silent for a minute, studying my face. When he spoke again, it was with slow deliberation. "Maybe you remember hearing tales long ago of the silent death. Certain isolationist congressmen and senators who spearheaded the opposition to interplanetary development died mysteriously and without visible cause. Malotrex was the cause of their deaths." I was culling out half-forgotten bits of information that I had learned as a schoolboy. But how? Again the purple-flecked palm raised to interrupt me. Earthmen are hot-blooded. The chemical analysis of their bodies. But I won't bother you with the technicalities. In plain language, once a chain of Malotrex circles human flesh, it begins to shrink, slowly, almost invisibly. It grows tighter and tighter until it becomes a strangler's noose, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that the Earthman can do about it. Once the clasp is fastened, no matter how he tries, he cannot undo it, nor, after a few minutes, can he loosen the chain from his skin. In most cases, the victim is taken completely unaware by the death creeping upon him. Malotrex constricts gradually and painlessly, except for the last spluttering moment of life. My knees felt a little weak, and my stomach queasy. Why tell me? Why should you let me in on this secret? Rosie's smile became more intimate. "Mrs. Terrain is not exactly popular among Martians," he said softly. "If I remember correctly, she is the chairman of the League to Oppose Interplanetary Marriage, and has financed the Earth Citizens Council, to name only a few of the discriminatory organizations with which she has linked herself. Perhaps you, as her heir, could put her fortune to a better use." "There's no doubt of that," I said. "Well then. But I've no desire to be dissolved in the death ray chamber for murder. Nor is there any need to do so. Look, was a single one of our assassins caught? But the necklace would be found embedded in her flesh." He shook his head. "Perhaps I've not made the situation clear. The pumping of the heart, the warmth of the blood, cause Malotrex to contract. As soon as death sets in, the necklace resumes its normal proportions. The clasp can be unfastened, the necklace removed, and as long as the ends do not meet, it remains completely harmless." I gulped again. Murder in the abstract is one thing. Planned, cold-blooded murder is something else again. But Maudie dead, and all that money in my hands. Suddenly I laughed as I saw where my thoughts were leading me. The whole thing was a hoax of some kind. As before, Rosie seemed to read my mind. He reached for my wrist and twisted the necklace about it. I stared at the delicate change in fascination. As I watched, I could see the metal shrink, barely perceptibly, but certainly for all that. I clawed at the clasp and tried to unfasten it. It was utterly hopeless, and swift panic swept over me. I grasped the slender chain and tried to wrench it free. It was tougher than finely tempered steel. Sweat popped out on my forehead, and I could hardly repress a scream. With a knowing nod of his head, Rosie leaned forward and lifted my wrist. He opened the catch with a lazy flick of his fingers. I was breathing hard and scared half out of my wits, but I was caught in the trap that Rosie had set for me. Maudie dead, myself a millionaire, and no chance of being caught. This was too good to pass up. I knew it, and so did Rosie. All we had to do was agree on terms. Half an hour later, when I left the House of Fantastic Jewelry, the royal purple box with the murderer's chain lay in my pocket, beautifully gift-wrapped. I had to lay my plans carefully, but unwittingly. Maudie and Isabel conspired to make it easy. A dinner had been arranged at Maudie's apartment as a birthday celebration. The only other guests would be Sylvester and his wife. Maudie had been complaining of bad headaches of late, and never liked to go out after dinner, but she had purchased 4 tickets for the most popular play of the season, The Fairest of Ladies, and insisted that the 4 of us should see it. She would rest while we were gone, but would keep her light on so that Isabel could come in to kiss her good night. Everything went like clockwork. I bought a little gift for Maudie and presented it to her early in the evening. The dinner was very gay, and just as we were about to leave, I announced that I had another gift. Maudie was delighted with the chain. I didn't even have to fasten it around her neck as I had planned. She snapped the clasp herself and went to the mirror in the foyer, preening and admiring herself, and the necklace that winked and glittered in the light. I was the last one out of the door, and Maudie clung to me for a minute, drawing my head down to kiss me. Maybe she'd softened up enough to lend me a few thousand, I thought. But even if she had, it was too late. I couldn't very well snatch the necklace back, even if it were possible to release it from about her throat. I don't remember much about the play. I was thinking of Maudie all the time, and I was torn between all sorts of doubts and fears. One minute I'd be way down in the dumps, and the next I'd be floating up in the clouds, planning all the good times Isabel and I could have with Maudie's millions. In my mind, I'd see a picture of Maudie lying dead, and then I'd decide that Rosie had conned me, and Maudie would be as spry as ever when we got home. Sometimes I'd want it one way, and sometimes the other. I was really mixed up and on edge. The play seemed to last for about 10 light years, but actually it wasn't quite midnight when we caught a taxi outside the theatre. As soon as we rounded the corner and were in sight of the marquee of the apartment house, I knew something had gone wrong. 2 red and white police cars blocked off the entrance of the house, and a curious throng of people had gathered around. I'd expected to have a chance to retrieve the necklace before the police were called. In the confusion of discovering her body, no one would notice, or, even if someone did, it wouldn't appear particularly odd for me to unfasten the necklace and slip it in my pocket. After all, it would have been my last gift to her. With the police already on the scene, that part of the plan was out. Nothing was left except to play it by ear. We pushed our way through the curious idlers and the neighbours who'd come out into the halls. A cop was at the front door, but as soon as we'd identified ourselves, he ushered us into Maudie's big front room. Only 2 cops were there. I didn't get the smaller one's name, but the towering man in plain clothes introduced himself as Lieutenant Onset of Central Homicide. Just the mention of homicide was enough to give me the jitters bad, but fortunately Isabel stole the scene with a fit of hysterics that nearly blew the roof off the place. She distracted everyone with her screaming jag, long enough for me to slip into the bedroom for a look at Maudie. She lay straight on the bed, her arms flung out, her face contorted and blue, but not a mark on her throat. What I wanted most was to get my hands on the necklace, but when I drew close to her I could see that it was gone. I stood still, breathing hard, trying to collect my wits. Could the necklace have slipped off after death? I scanned the bedclothes, the carpet beside the bed, the medicine table. No sign of it. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room, but when I looked up, I found myself staring into the pale grey eyes of Lieutenant Onset. His face wore an official mask of blankness, but it was belied by the quirk of his lips. He knew something, I thought, or at least he was suspicious. I had to take a firm grip on myself not to make a break for it and try to rush past him to the freedom of the hall. Onset motioned me back to the front room. Isabel had quieted down, although she was still sobbing. Sylvester and his wife were sitting on the divan holding hands and looking distraught. I went to Isabel and slid my arms around her and waited to see what would come next. The questioning was all very polite, in perfect order. The details of the birthday dinner and the theatre party came out. We learned in turn that a friend of Maudie's, who had a key to the apartment, had dropped in to surprise her with a birthday gift and had discovered the body. There was some mention of the necklace, but neither Onset nor his partner pursued the matter. I was beginning to feel cocky again, sure that Maudie's death would be put down to accidental strangulation or a heart attack. In about an hour, we were all told that we could leave, but just as we got to the door, Onset called me back and asked me to wait. Sylvester offered to take Isabel home, and I didn't dare to protest too much. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to their footsteps die away in the hall, and then I turned to face Onset. His partner had disappeared, and the 2 of us were alone in the room. He sat down in an easy chair and crossed his legs. There wasn't anything for me to do but try to appear as much at ease as he. We sat there in silence for long minutes. Finally, Onset dug out a cigarette and offered me one. I took it and lit up. The smoke burned my throat, but having something to do with my hands helped. I was scared, but I reckoned that the best thing to do was put on a show of indignation. "What is this?" I blustered. "I've told you everything I know." He gave a thin smile. "I don't think so, Mr. Duff." "I don't care what you think. I've nothing more to say." He snuffed out his cigarette very carefully in one of Maudie's little mosaic ashtrays, and slowly his hand dipped into his pocket. When it came out, the necklace dangled from his fingers. I could feel my heart lurch, but I still tried to bluff it out, complaining about being separated from Isabel. Onset didn't say a word, just dangled the chain so that the light from the lamp rippled along its slender surface. In a few minutes I ran out of words. Onset gave a deep sigh and rose from his chair. "Do you want to tell me about this little gift to your mother-in-law?" I clamped my lips shut. "I'm through. Finished. I'll not say another word." The quirk of his lips reminded me of Melvin Rosey. He raised the chain over my head, and the next thing I knew it was about my throat. My fingers scrabbled for it, but I couldn't pry it loose. I gave up and stared at Onset in stunned silence. His hands were still outstretched, and as I looked up at them, I could see the tiny purple flecks in his palms. I couldn't believe it, not at first. Whoever heard of a Martian making the New York police force? But when he spoke, his voice had dropped its growl. It was soft and musical, a Martian voice. He said, "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. You'll write it all down, too." Like I said before, it's really uncanny the way some of these Martian chaps can read your mind. He was right, straight down the line. I told him everything. I wrote it all down and didn't waste any time about it because every second the necklace was growing smaller and smaller. When I finished, I signed it and pushed it over to him. Here it is.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Star Beast by Damon Knight. Originally published in Planet Stories, Spring 1949. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The observation deck of the President Marcus, this early in the ship's arbitrary morning, was deserted, except for two shapeless figures. One of them was dead. The body was sprawled in the curve of the deck about midway between two of the entrance wells. It had arms and legs, if you looked closely enough at the limp tangle of garments. It had a grey beard and a purple face. The other figure had neither limbs nor a face. It was black, and it looked more like a pile of mud than anything else. A 5-foot lump of black mud, slightly flattened at either side, with a cluster of black stumpy filaments at the top. It moved slightly, dropping the filaments a little toward the dead body. Then it flowed away again, and the filaments pointed straight up toward the stars. Phil Horrocks came up at the forward end of the deck. He let the levator push him gently clear of the well, then stepped over to the glassine and looked out at the tiny blue disk that was Earth. His back was to the body and its watcher. He struck a cigarette, inhaling deeply, then turned around. He swore and threw his cigarette away, leaping forward at the same instant. He skidded to a halt in front of the corpse and fell to one knee beside it. "Dead," he said. "Oh, Lord." He searched the body swiftly and came up with a flat metal box attached by a silver chain to the body's middle. He tried the lid. It opened easily. The box was empty. Horrocks sighed and lifted the dead man's chin. Under the grey beard was a deeply indented red line that encircled the throat. He stood up and pressed a button on his wrist transceiver. "Walsh," he said. "Summers. Get up to the observation deck. Thomason has been murdered." A deep voice swore fervently in his ear. He didn't wait for it to finish. He made an adjustment on the transceiver and said, "Captain Tucker, please. This is Philip Horrocks." A querulous male voice spoke. "Yes, Horrocks. What you want?" Horrocks repeated his message and added, "I'm bringing the body down to Thomason's stateroom. Get the ship's doctor and meet me there." Two figures exploded out of the levator well a dozen yards away, one bulky and grey-haired, the other lean and young. They ran up to Horrocks, panting. The bulky one, Walsh, was still swearing. "I watched him like a baby," he protested. "He told me he was going to get up at 9 this morning, so I set my watch for 8. Why the howling hell did he—" "Save it," said Horrocks. "He did. I'll take his head. Summers, you take his feet. Walsh, think you can carry Oscar?" "Listen, Phil," said Summers abruptly. "Are the equations gone?" "Yes," Horrocks told him. "They're gone." Walsh grunted and, stooping, wrapped his arm around the black thing. He lifted it without apparent effort. The stumpy tendrils waved down toward him, then stood upright again, ignoring him. The other two picked up the body of Thomason, and all three walked back to the levator well from which they had come. Captain Tooker and the medical officer, Dr. Evans, met them at the door of the dead man's stateroom. Tooker was boiling over. "Do you call yourselves security agents?" he shouted. "3 of you, to protect 1 man, and you couldn't do it. I'll raise hell about this, Horrocks, see if I don't." Horrocks and Summers put the body down on the bed, and Dr. Evans fell quietly to examining it. "We'll find the killer," said Horrocks grimly, "or else any hell you can raise will be a sneeze in a gale of wind. You don't know the half of this yet." "I know that a man has been murdered on my ship," said Tooker. "A man?" said Summers, staring at him. "A whole planet may have been murdered unless we get the equations back." "What equations?" said Tooker. "What the devil are you talking about?" "The Thomason equations," said Summers, "are the answer to the problem of faster-than-light space travel. Professor Thomason derived them from observations he made on the space shell. This thing," he gestured at Oscar, "landed on Pluto in last year." Captain Tooker glanced at Oscar with evident dislike. "Well," he said, "what are you going to do about it?" "Have the ship searched," said Horrocks quietly. "But that won't do any good. There are 100 ways the killer could hide the equations so that no search would ever find them. Our one chance, I'm afraid, is to get the only witness to tell us who garroted Thomason." "The witness?" said the captain, staring. "Who?" Horrocks turned to look at the black 5-foot lump with its gently waving tendrils. "Oscar," he said. Oscar had come whirling out of interstellar space almost a year ago, in a thin, cloudy shell hardly bigger than himself. The shell was partly wrecked and put out of control, but by sheer luck a supply ship had picked it up and hauled it into Pluto. The newspapers had labelled its occupant a Centaurian, since it came from that general sector of space, but actually no one knew. The scientists at the Pluto station who had sweated over him for a year had found out exasperatingly little. He had no eyes or ears, and yet he was aware of things around him. He had no recognizable brain. He had no skeleton, no lungs, no circulatory system, and no excretory system. He got his energy, they thought, from cosmic radiation, but they didn't know for sure. His tendrils, or filaments, the stumpy finger-like organs on top of his shapeless body, had no function that they would discover. They did not respond to sound, to light, to heat, or any other known radiation, but they followed moving objects in a dark room as well as in a light one. He was somehow able to emit and receive radio waves. They were able to communicate with him, after a fashion, that way. They suspected it wasn't his normal method of communication, but when they ticked at him with a Morse sender, he obligingly ticked back. Slowly and painfully, during that year, they had worked up from 1 + 1 = 2, to 9 cubed is 729, to simple nouns and a few verbs in a code they invented as they went along. They could talk to Oscar, and Oscar could talk to them. The only trouble was that nothing Oscar said made much sense to men. "That's the whole difficulty," explained Dr. Y. Ilyanov, running her finger through her thick yellow hair. Dr. Ilyanov was one of the 2 assistants Thomason had brought along, and very beautiful. The other was Dr. Hugh Mears, who was bald and not beautiful at all. "You understand, he perceives, but he doesn't perceive with human senses or think in human patterns. Undoubtedly, He saw Professor Thomason killed, but he saw it differently.
If we could only get some scrap of description, said Walsh. Surely he can tell size, for instance. If we knew whether the murderer was a big man or a little man, even that would help.
You're thinking, I'll venture, of a particularly big man, said Dr. Mears. Carson Johor, the ambassador from the Jovian Federation.
Horrocks nodded. A prime suspect. The Federation has always been too big for its planets. They'd give anything for a space drive that would let them beat Earth to the punch in interstellar colonization. Well, said Walsh, what about my question? Can't Oscar tell the difference between a big man and a little one?
Dr. Mears's brow wrinkled. Not in the way a man could, he said. If you put them side by side, then perhaps yes. Perhaps, mind you. But, don't you see, he hasn't got one of our senses, except touch. Instead, he probably has a whole gamut of his own. Lord only knows how he differentiates between one man and another, or between one apple and another. He doesn't do it our way, anyhow.
Look here, said Captain Tooker impatiently. We're wasting time. Why can't we just search everybody on board?
Have you got authority, asked Horrocks carefully, to strip Ambassador Johor and his wife to the skin and put them and all their belongings through 520 different chemical solutions? For a starter, that is. If you have, go ahead. I haven't.
The captain shuddered.
Just the same, said Horrocks, standing up. You're right. We are wasting time. Have you got that passenger list, Captain?
Yes, here, Tooker said, producing it. I've got to get back. If anything happens, buzz me. And it had better be soon, he added as he left.
All right. Horrocks turned to the two scientists. Dr. Mears, can you and Dr. Ilyanov make Oscar understand this much? That he's to signal when he sees the man who was with Thomason on the observation deck this morning.
Mears shrugged.
We can try, he said. I won't promise anything.
He pulled his chair over to the crude Morse set on the table and began clicking the key.
Oscar's tendrils waved slowly back and forth, as if he were interested in anything in the world but radio clicks.
Mears stopped, waited a moment, then tried again.
Tick, tick, said the amplifier.
Mears nodded.
He says yes. Whether he really knows what we want or not, I can't say. Horrocks spoke into his transceiver. Central, will you please page Mr. Abbott, Miss Akison, Mr. and Mrs. Adler, and Mr. Aguirre's. Ask them to come to stateroom B39. One by one, the passengers whose names began with A were let into the stateroom and presented to Oscar. Oscar said nothing. The passengers, bewildered or indignant, were ushered out, and a new batch came in. They went through the B's, the C's, the D's, the E's, the F's, the G's, the H's, the I's. The whole list numbered about 150, some of whom had been shuttled aboard at the Jovian system, others at Mars. Finally, Horrocks called a halt for lunch. Dr. Mears, pleading indisposition, had gone to lie down in his stateroom. The three security men were alone with Dr. Ilyanov and Oscar. Walsh, munching a corned beef sandwich, stared at the black lump balefully.
Honestly, Dr. Ilyanov, he said, doesn't he ever give you the creeps?
She smiled slightly. Honestly, yes. I dream about him sometimes. Summers glanced at her curiously. What do you dream? He asked. Well, she hesitated. It's really silly, but last night, you see, I was thinking of something poor Professor Thomason had said, half jokingly, when we were discussing Oscar. He said that Oscar might not be a complete organism. She gestured toward the black thing on the table. You know, his flat underside that he walks with, and those curious flat areas along his sides. He can grip with those. If you put your hand there, he grips it." Horace nodded. "Thomason showed me that trick." He reached over and put his hand on Oscar's black, glutinous side. "Shake hands, Oscar." The hand sank visibly in the black flesh. When Horace pulled it away, there was a small sucking noise. "Ugh," said Walsh disgustedly. "Well," continued Dr. Ilyanov, "you know that Oscar's space shell was wrecked. Professor Thomason suggested that the accident that wrecked it might have wrecked Oscar too. That really, when he is all there, he is 3 or 4 Oscars linked together." She laughed embarrassedly. "Anyhow, when I slept last night, I had this nightmare. I dreamed that I saw Oscar floating in space, but there was more of him. There was another similar shape attached behind him, and 2 smaller ones, one on either side. He was like a sort of black cross, with those horrible tassels waving at each point of it, floating along under the stars." "Well," said Horace puzzledly, "what was so horrible about that?" "Why, I don't know," said Dr. Ilyanov, "but it was." Horace crumpled up his sandwich wrappers and threw them into the waste chute. "Might as well get started again," he said. He picked up the passenger list and read, "Jaeger, Johor, Jessamine, Johnson." Oscar watched interestedly as the beings in the room moved about, trailing their flaming auras. These people had strange and sometimes frightening counterpoints, he thought, but they were undeniably picturesque. He would have a story to tell when he got home. One of the creatures arose and moved across the room. Its glowing sheath was bright reeve, with radiating streaks of darker gel. Inside, the shadowy nucleus seemed to be constructed differently from the others. Oscar followed it with the waving feelers atop its own nucleus. If he could only get into syntax with that one, he thought, he might find out something about it. Perhaps it had been badly Morlond when it was young, or perhaps it was a different species entirely. It was hard to see with these people. 2 more beings came into the room, one of them tall but with a slight nucleus shaped like the one he had just been examining. He felt it with interest, but it was as uncommunicative as the other. The figure beside it was of an uninspiring shape, but its aura was reminiscent. He recalled that something was expected of him. Carson Johor was a big man, with the dark skin and fair hair that characterized his race. He was saying loudly, "I won't stand for it, you hear? Do you think you can drag me and my wife in here like any common suspect? I'll hear an apology, or by God, heads will roll." "Tick, tick, tick," said the amplifier on the table. "There's your apology," said Horace, his eyes shining. "Where have you hidden the equations, Ambassador Johor?" "What is this?" roared the ambassador. "What equations? What's that thing? Are you all mad?" Dr. Ilyanov put a hand on Horace's arm. "Please," she said, "don't be hasty. We don't know that Oscar understands, remember? Let's at least run through the rest of the passenger list and see if he picks out anyone else." "I've never heard such nonsense in my life," put in Mrs. Johora, who was small and sultry. "Come along, Carson. Let's go and tell the captain." "I've already buzzed the captain," said Horace. He glanced at Dr. Ilyanov. "You're right, of course. Walsh, take Ambassador and Mrs. Johor into the other room. If they make any trouble, give them a jolt." Walsh, with his electro-gun out, herded the pair into the next room. Johor's shouts continued for some time. "Ask Oscar if he was sure," suggested Summers. Dr. Ilyanov stepped to the Morse sender and tapped out the message. "Tick, tick," said Oscar. "Well, that's good enough for me," said Summers, "but we might as well have the rest in, I suppose." The captain called Horace via his wrist phone, swore fearfully when he heard that they had bagged the ambassador, and promised to come down later. Horace continued to read off lists of names to the central operator, bringing in groups of passengers whose nervousness increased as rumours spread through the ship. Horrid strode up and down the room, slamming one fist into the palm of the other hand. "There must be something we've overlooked," he said. "We've got to figure out what the semantic block is between us and Oscar. I know it's something simple. I feel it, but—" Dr. Ilyanov was frowning thoughtfully. "I have an idea," she said. "Did it ever occur to you that Dr. Tooker might be the man we're looking for?" "Tooker?" said Horace. "Yes. You saw how jealous he is of his job on this ship. If the Thomason equations were used, he would certainly be put out of work. To a man like that, it would be worse than death. And remember, he has not been in this room since we asked Oscar to point out the killer." "You might be right," said Horace slowly. "But even if Oscar puts the finger on him, it wouldn't prove anything unless we can find out what Oscar means." "Please try it," said the girl. I have a theory." "Yes," said Horace. She flushed slowly. "I know it sounds absurd," she said, "but I think Oscar has been pointing out all the ones on this ship who could have killed Professor Thomason, who had reasons to. I think he perceives that, just as we'd perceive a man's height or his manner of walking." Horace looked at her doubtfully. "Don't you see?" she went on. "That would explain why he pointed out two when we asked for only one. They look the same to him. He can't tell them apart." "Maybe you've got it," said Horace. He opened the transceiver and said, "Captain Tooker, please. Horace calling." "Yes, Horace," said the captain's voice. "Can you come down immediately? I think we've got this thing licked." The captain walked in a few minutes later. "Horace," he said, "you deserve a medal. Who is it?" "Tick, tick, tick," said the amplifier. "Maybe you," Horace told him. He produced his electrogun and waved the captain over toward the wall. "No offense, but I've got to make sure." "What?" shouted the captain, his face reddening. "Are you crazy, Horace? Put that gun down." "Shut up," said Horace. "Please." He moved over to the connecting door, opened it, and said, "Bring them out." Walsh and Summers herded their prisoners back into the room. The Johors had subsided some time before, but broke out afresh when they saw that they were not going to be released. The captain tried to outshout the Johors, and it took Horace a full minute to quieten them. When they were silent at last, he said, "Oscar has pointed out each of you as the one who murdered Professor Thomason. Now's the time to confess." No one said anything. Horace picked up the passenger list from the table and glanced at it. "All right," he said. He adjusted his transceiver and said, "Steward's department. This is Horace, in stateroom B39. I want the stewards who serve A deck section 3, C deck section 5, and the captain's quarters. Get them down here fast." The stewards arrived, looking apprehensive. There were 5 of them in all, 2 for each of the passenger sections, and 1 for Tooker. The latter said to Horace, "Is there anything wrong, sir?" "Nothing that need worry you," Horace told them. "Just stand there and answer any questions I may ask you." He turned to Johore. "Professor Thomason was killed at a very early hour this morning," he said. "According to the ship's doctor, he had been dead approximately 30 minutes when I found him, and that was at 7:30. What time did you leave your stateroom this morning, Ambassador?" "I don't know that concerns you, you insolent puppy," Johor replied. "Answer him, dearest," said his wife. "Let's get this beastly business over." "Oh, very well," said the ambassador. "I was up at 9. "Is that correct?" Horace said to the stewards. One of them spoke up. "Yes, sir, I believe so. I was in the corridor when His Excellency came out, and it was about 9 o'clock, sir." Horace bowed slightly. "You have my apologies, Ambassador. You and your wife may go now." "Just a minute," said Summers unexpectedly. "Oscar clicked when both the ambassador and his wife were in the room, didn't he? Mrs. Johore, when did you leave the stateroom?" "At 10:30, the woman said coldly. That's correct, sir, said the steward. I was working in that section almost all the morning, and I saw Mrs. Johore leave at that time. Please accept my apologies also, said Tooker through the Johores, trying to curb his apoplexy. I assure you, sir, that this was none of my doing. You're not out of the woods yet yourself, Captain, said Horrocks wryly. Mrs. Johore tugged at her husband's sleeve, but the ambassador looked interested. You're in this too, are you? He said to Tooker. I think I'll stay and see the finish. Horace looked at Tooker. Well, Captain? I was up at 6:30, said the captain. Right, said Horace. The steward coughed. Approximately right, sir. I should say that it was more nearly 6:40. Where did you go, Captain Tooker? Asked Horace. To the control room? Certainly. Who was on duty there? First mate Marshall, said the captain angrily. Horace lifted his transceiver. All right, said the captain, raising his hand. I didn't arrive at the control room until 7:30. I can't account for the time either, or rather I won't. I suppose you think you can burn me for that. Maybe, said Horace soberly. For your own sake, I advise you to tell me where you were. The captain wilted suddenly. I was visiting a certain lady, he said. That's all I'll tell you, but it's the truth. He stiffened again and glared at Horace. If it comes to that, what time did you get up this morning? 7:20, said Horace. Well, it's one of you two, he began. One of the stewards coughed. Excuse me, sir, he said, but what you said isn't true. Horace looked at him without comprehension. What isn't true? He asked. You didn't get up at 7:20, sir. I saw you leave at not later than 6:45, sir. Horace simply stared at him. What are you lying for? He asked, puzzled. I'm not lying, the man said stiffly. I remember distinctly, because I thought it was odd at the time. You left your room at 7:15, and then I saw you come back about 20 minutes later. Both times you had a funny sort of expression on your face. Sort of dazed you looked. When you came back, you had some papers in one hand, and you were carrying your belt in the other, sir. The others were all staring at Horace. His belt, said Summers. His gun swiveled to point at Horace. I'm sorry, Phil. Drop your gun. Horace dropped it, and Walsh scooped it up. Then he went into his stateroom and locked the door, said the steward excitedly, and about 7:20 he came out again, looking for all the world as if he'd just waked up. I went into the room, being a little curious, and looked around to see if I could see the papers or anything. I didn't see the papers, but there was scraps of burnt paper and ashes all around the waste chute. It looked to me as if he burnt them up. Horace felt numb. The words he was hearing, incredibly, awoke echoes of memory, a memory that had not been there an instant before. Burn them, said the girl, her eyes wide. But why? Summers was speaking rapidly into his wrist transceiver, and a few moments later the ship's doctor bustled in, carrying his badge. Give your belt to Dr. Evans, Phil, said Summers. This is crazy, thought Horace to himself. I'm dreaming. He took off the thin rawhide band he wore about his waist and handed it over to the doctor. I remember his face, he thought, his purple face but I didn't. I couldn't have. The doctor took the belt, casting a sharp glance at Horace, and held it up to the light in his gloved hands. He took a bulky instrument from his bag, clipped a section of the belt into its base, and peered at it through the eyepieces. He looked up after a moment and nodded. Traces of human skin, he said. This is undoubtedly the instrument which was used to kill Professor Thomason. I think I understand now. Dr. Ilyanov said slowly, staring straight ahead of her. "We forgot one person who had a motive. Oscar. He didn't want us to reach the stars." She turned until her wide gaze rested on Horwitz's face. "And you shook hands with him," she said. The nightmare boiled up in Horwitz's head. Impossible things, memories from nowhere, battled with his sanity. The silent decks, the slow dreamlike progress upward into starlight, and the hideous purple face staring impersonally into his. Raging, his mind retreated, flung itself away from the thing that was hurting it. He felt his body in motion, felt himself caught, struggling, but it was as if he were a far-off spectator. The words that came to him were meaningless. Walsh and Summers, holding him, looked at each other across the prostrate body. The muscles on Walsh's heavy forearms stood out, and there was sweat on Summers's forehead. Gradually, the struggle subsided. Horwitz lay still and white, looking upward at nothing. Dr. Ilyanov came to kneel over him. She said, "He will be cured, and he can't be punished, of course." She turned her head slowly toward the black shape across the room. "But," she said, "neither can that thing." Oscar's tentacles writhed delicately.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Formula for Murder by Milton A. Rothman, writing as Lee Gregor, originally published in Infinity, November 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Chapter 1. The figure of Professor Glover slipped from the surface of the space station and twinkled away among the stars. Jim Britton stared at it as though he could call it back by the ferocity of his gaze. He stood paralyzed by helplessness while the space-suited body plummeted off into the void, until he could no longer follow its motion towards the dazzling sun. Seized by an uncontrollable shaking, he dropped the radiophone antenna which he had ripped from Glover's back and flung himself down flat upon the surface of the station, where he clung while catching his breath. A vast donut, 25 miles in diameter, the space station stood with no apparent motion 1,000 miles above the surface of the earth. It floated in a sea of scintillating stars, like diamonds scattered upon a blackest velvet. "Jim, what's the matter?" John Callahan's voice grated in Britton's headpiece. "Glover's line broke loose," Britton gasped. "He's gone." "What?" "I'm coming back in. Give me a hand." Britton began the long crawl back to the entrance port, his nerves too shattered to attempt it standing up. He was several yards away when another spacesuited figure emerged from the port and helped him stagger the rest of the way. Inside the airlock, he collapsed. In a small room within a large hospital, the two men sat talking. It was a featureless room with pale green walls, containing a desk, 2 soft chairs, and a leather couch. The doctor, middle-aged, inconspicuous, wearing glasses, a small moustache, and a grey suit, sat in one chair. Facing him in the other chair, Jim Britton, young, lean, and visibly depressed, wore pyjamas and a hospital robe. "You've been a sick boy," Morris Wolfe told Jim Britton in a conversational tone. "I guess so." Britton scratched at the arm of his chair and fingered the sleeve of his gown. "You're coming along, though. When you arrived at the hospital a week ago, you had to be wheeled in and fed like a baby. Now you've pulled out of the hole, and we're ready to do some real talking." "But, Doc, I don't know what happened, honestly. One minute Glover was starting to climb down into the iron source chamber, and the next minute his magnet line came loose, and when I grabbed after him I caught his phone antenna and ripped it off. Then I got the shakes, and the next thing I knew I was back on Earth in the hospital." The psychiatrist reached for his pipe and began to fill it from a large can on the desk. "It's a great shock to have the person next to you snuffed out like that," he said. "Some people can take it standing up. When you fall apart like that, we want to know the reason, so it won't happen again." Britton shrugged. "What's the difference? I'll never work in a laboratory again, let alone the Lunatron. I'll never finish my research, and I'll never get my degree." His voice trailed off in a discouraged whisper. Wolf watched him for a moment. "That kind of talk is the reason you are still here. You'll work in a laboratory again, and you'll get your degree. You're still not quite well. I'm here to help you get well." Britton shrugged again. "Okay, bring on the dancing girls," he said in a resigned tone. There were no dancing girls, however. Only a tall, blonde, squarish doctor in a white dress, who waited for them in the therapy room. Her cigarette made a cocky angle with a firm line of her mouth as she made final adjustments on the bank of electronic equipment that lined one whole wall. "Jim, this is Dr. Heller," Wolf told him as they walked into the room. "She will work with us in here. Now suppose you get up on this table." The two husky attendants, who were always in the background, helped Britton onto the table and strapped him down. As Wolf fastened the electrodes to Britton's head, he said conversationally, "In the old days, we would have just sat and talked to each other. It would have taken months to get to first base. Now we have ways of aiding the memory, of triggering associations, of lowering resistances to thoughts. It makes psychotherapy a much less tedious process than it used to be." As he spoke, he slipped a hypodermic needle into Britton's arm. "Now, suppose we see how much we can remember. Let's begin the day before Glover was killed. I want you to think back to that day and remember everything that happened, how you felt, what you thought about. We want to go through this traumatic experience of yours and relate it to the elements in your life which caused such a profound shock." And in addition, Wolf thought bleakly to himself, a good many people were anxious to know other things. For example, was Glover's demise at this particular time a coincidence? The Atomic Energy Commission, though cagey about their reasons, had given top priority to the answers to their questions. The strength of official interest in this case was further evidenced by the assignment of Bill Grady and Calvin Jones as attendants to Jim Britton. For some time, Maurice Wolfe had wondered vaguely why two such clean-cut and alert young men should follow the low-paid calling of hospital attendant. Until recently, he had become aware that their paychecks actually came from the U.S. Treasury by way of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Now," Wolfe said, as Alma Heller switched on the tape recorder, "tell us what you remember." After a year of being stationed on the Lunatron, Jim Britton had the feeling of being fed up. Lunatics, they call us, he thought. Real crazy. Looking out of the ports, he saw a black starry space in which the only thing that ever changed was the view of the earth 1,000 miles below, and the moon, which was sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other. The stars were incredible jewels, and the sun was something that no one ever looked at with mortal eyes. There was bitterness in his heart as he thought of his initial thrill at being chosen to do his thesis research on the Lunatron. He had been an envied boy, but now, after a year, he would have given the chance to the first bidder. But there was no way to back out, short of breaking his contract or breaking his neck. Passage to and from Earth was too costly to be used on weekend vacations. Many people on Earth would have been excited by the chance to work for 2 years with Professor Glover on the 10,000 billion volt proton synchrotron, which they called the lunatron. Most physicists thought they were lucky if they could spend a few months with the 50 billion volt antique at Brookhaven. But at Brookhaven, you were only a few minutes from New York. Up on the space laboratory, Britain was a year from any place, and every day that went by made it a day less. "Johnny, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get back to Rhodesia?" he asked his roommate. Britain sat, twanging half-heartedly at his guitar, while Johnny lay undressed on his bunk, his body hard and black against the white sheet. "Oh, I have a good job lined up in a brand new research institute in Salisbury." "I don't mean that," Britain said impatiently. Johnny was such a serious boy. "I mean, don't you think of all the fun you're going to have when you get back to Earth? Don't you think of getting a girlfriend and living like everybody else lives?" But Johnny's deep brown eyes remained serious, and he said, "Coming up here has been a great opportunity to learn something so that I will be able to do good work when I get back. Everybody down there does not get such a chance." Well, Britain thought, that's how it had been with him at first. Now he could think of nothing but walking arm in arm with a pretty girl, his girl, down the street of a big city at night, drinking in the excitement, the feeling of being with other people among the bright lights, under a sky that would be dark blue instead of black, that might have clouds in it, that might even send down rain, instead of being the stark, changeless interstellar space that existed up above. Scientists aren't supposed to have thoughts like these. But Britain was young, he was homesick, and he was bored. A young, homesick scientist cannot remain a solemn, dedicated, single-minded scientist. The next day at work, he absent-mindedly switched on some pieces of apparatus in the wrong order and burned out a minor piece of electronics. "Damn it, Britain!" Professor Glover shouted at him. "Where are your brains? Replacements are expensive up here. Time is expensive." Britain began shaking with rage. Words rushed to his tongue which he choked down unsaid because Glover had the power of life or death over his degree, and these 2 years must not be torn out of his life for nothing. "I'm sorry," he said in an unsteady voice. "I guess I'm not all here today. It won't take long to repair the damage." "Never mind," Glover said. "You're coming off the project anyway." Britain stood still. The anger roared back into his head. "I'm coming off the project? What happens to the year I've just spent?" Glover suddenly seemed more embarrassed than angry. "I'm sorry, Britain," he said, "but it's for your own good. The project has just become classified, and you'd never get a publishable thesis out of it." Britain stood there, looking at Glover. "This is a hell of a time to tell me," he exploded finally. "What's become so secret about this experiment?" "Obviously, I can't tell you. I'm sorry, but we'll make it up to you somehow. We'll think of something you can do while you're here, and if necessary, you can stay a little longer." "Stay longer?" Outraged, Britain fled to his room. It was all he could do to stick out the remainder of his 2 years. He could not sleep that night. Little teeth of anger nibbled into his mind, while the basic question repeated itself in endless circles. Why had his experiment been pulled out from under him? Fundamental experiments in high-energy particle physics were not generally classified secret. What were they doing which had suddenly become so important? The general purpose of the space laboratory was to gather basic information about the laws of nature. The optical telescope studied the planets as well as the farthest nebulae, unimpeded by atmospheric disturbances. The tremendous 25-mile diameter radio telescope pinpointed short-wave radio vibrations from all parts of space. The solid-state group could study the properties of matter in a vacuum chamber of rarity unattainable anywhere on Earth. In Jim Britton's group, known variously as the Elementary Particle Division, the Lunatron Group, or simply as the Lunatics, the topic of investigation was the meson. A long time ago, people had considered atoms the most elementary particles. Then they found out about protons and neutrons, which were the bricks that made up the atomic nuclei. A little later, when scientists learned how to build atom smashers such as the 2 billion volt proton synchrotron, they found that they could knock mesons out of the nucleus, and they decided that the protons and neutrons were not so simple after all. Year after year, the atom smashers had become bigger and bigger. There came a time when they could not be built on the surface of the Earth any longer, so a space laboratory was conceived, built around the donut of the 10,000 billion volt proton synchrotron. Protons, whirling around for thousands of cycles in this vast donut, 80 miles in circumference, could acquire energies equal to those of the most powerful cosmic rays. Even mesons shattered at this energy. By inspecting the remnants of these broken mesons, scientists could begin to get some idea as to the ultimate structure of matter and energy. Now, Jim Britton thought, what was there about this work that should suddenly become too secret to be published? Peace had reigned on Earth for many years, and it was once more fashionable to think of science as being free and unbound by security regulations. But not, apparently, here in Glover's private domain. Rephrase the question, Britton thought. What was there about this work which had suddenly made it desirable for Professor Glover to take Britton off the project? Was there more to this experiment than Britton had seen up to the present? Sitting through the night, Britton thought and calculated, filling his desktop with paper, feeling the frustration of a scientist who spends day after day with the details of an experiment, pushing buttons, reading meters, soldering wires, until he begins to lose sight of the ultimate aim of the project. As he fell asleep, long towards morning, his anger was still at a furious temperature, filling his mind with dreams of a tormented, violent nature, which he forgot promptly upon awakening. Professor Glover stopped by to see him as he ate a late breakfast. "We have a job to do today," Glover said, his voice tinged with an impersonal annoyance that was not directed at Britton. Britton stared up at Glover with a hostility that made no impression upon the scientist. "The iron source has gone bad and has to be replaced," Glover continued. "The spacesuits are being readied in the airlock." "Why us?" Britton complained. "What's the matter with the maintenance crew?" Glover's frown deepened. "They're busy with other things. You're free for the moment, and so am I." Then his face cleared, and he slapped Britton on the back. "Come on, fella, snap out of it. It'll do us both good to put on the suits and get out in free space." Britton uttered grumbling noises about, "A guy can't even finish a cup of coffee," and followed Glover out to the maintenance lock nearest the iron source. As he climbed out of the airlock, there again came the sensation of vertigo which he felt every time he stood on this island suspended in nothingness. The circumference of the donut stretched its great arc away from him in both directions, while 12 miles away, at the centre of the circle, was the spherical shape of the radio telescope receiver. The long, slender girders which bound the station together had a fragile, spidery appearance. Britton and Glover walked clumsily to the linear accelerator which projected 1 billion volt protons into the initial lap of their long journey around the donut. At the far end of the 100-foot tube, within a shielded chamber, was the glass bottle of the iron source. Normally, a brilliant crimson flame glowed within this bottle as numberless protons were stripped from their electrons to be hurled down the accelerator tubes. Now there was nothing but the blackened, dead glass. As they approached the chamber that surrounded the iron source, Britton found that the resentment left over from the previous night had a new object upon which to fasten. Why should he be doing the work that belonged to the technicians? In his anger, he lost sight of the fact that Professor Glover was out there doing the same thing. Damned slave labour, he thought. A PhD candidate was at the bottom of the heap, the lowest form of existence, pushed around by everybody else. Glover thought he was being clever, pushing him off the project, making excuses about security, when probably his aim was to keep for himself the noble prize that the experiment was going to receive some day. Thought he could keep his poor stupid student in the dark about the outcome of the experiment. But the poor student wasn't as stupid as he thought. Glover reached the hatch that opened into the iron source chamber and started undoing the fastenings. Suddenly he turned and stared at Ritten. "Where's the new iron source?" he snapped. "Don't tell me you left it in the airlock." Ritten stammered wordlessly, shocked out of his reverie. "Well, of all the stupid, go back and get it. I'll remove the old source." Glover turned his back and continued to unfasten the hatch. Rage came into full bloom instantly. Without an instant's thought, Ritten reached out both hands, wrenched the antenna rod from Glover's back, tore his anchoring lines from their snaps, and pushed the struggling body out into space, where it soon dwindled away into a tiny speck. Chapter 2. Dr. Maurice Wolfe leaned back in his chair after Jim Britton was wheeled, asleep, from the therapy room. In a random fashion, he let his mind wander over the story he had just heard, savouring not only the facts, but the feelings behind them, and the intuitions which they built up in his own mind. "Well, Alma, what do you think?" he said, swivelling his chair to look at the other doctor across his desk. She hesitated. "The story seems satisfactory, up to a point. That is, we've broken through the memory block and have determined that Glover's death was not really an accident, which of course we suspected all along. And we have a motive, of a sort." Wolfe sighed. "Yes, the motive. The boy feels that Glover is cutting him out of the credit for an important experiment, so in a burst of anger he disposes of the professor. There are just two things that bother me about that. Look." He switched on his desk projector and ran through the microfilm card on Britton's record until he came to the examinations which Britton had taken to get to the post on the space station. "Here we have the standard Jameson test for paranoid personality. Obviously an important item in an examination of this sort. You wouldn't send even an incipient paranoid into close quarters with a group of people for 2 years. And so in the case of Jim Britton, the Jameson test gives a negative result. No evidence of any paranoia, and in fact no evidence of any neurosis except the drive to do research." Alma Heller lit a cigarette thoughtfully. "I see. No paranoia predicted, yet the story he tells us now is a typical textbook example of persecution psychosis. Of course," she paused for a moment, "he might be making up this story to hide his real motive." Wolfe shook his head vigorously. "No dice. Not under deep therapy. He has to tell us the truth." "So we have a paradox." Dr. Heller's methodical mind ticked off the possibilities systematically. "Either the early exam was wrong, in which case he was paranoid all the time, or the exam was right, and he turned paranoid later, neither of which things are supposed to happen. Or," Wolfe presented the third possibility, "he is withholding information while in deep therapy, also something that is not supposed to happen. So this leads us to the second point that bothers me. Britton talks about sitting up all night trying to figure out what his experiment was leading to, yet he never mentioned what conclusion he came to. Apparently this is a crucial point which is buried in his mind so deeply that we didn't touch it with our first try." "Could be?" Alma Heller seemed sceptical. "There are a lot of very iffy questions running around in my head which could be settled simply if we could get some concrete information. Do you think you could buzz the AEC and ask them why Britain's project became classified? That would settle a number of obscure points and at the same time give us a handle with which to pry Jim open a little more. Wolf shrugged. We might get our heads chopped off, but we can try. My contact at the AEC is Charles Wilford. He's the one who was so anxious to know what Britain did the night of the 15th. Maybe he can trade us some information. Wolf pushed the button for an outside line and asked for the Atomic Energy Commission, extension 5972. Wilford's image appeared on the phone screen, the picture of a large, powerful face with a great mass of grey hair. Wolf knew him only as someone high up in the personnel department of the AEC. "Good morning, Dr. Wolf," he said. "Find anything out?" Wolf shrugged. "Britain killed Glover, if that's what you want to know. But why? That's what really interests us. You can tell us one thing that will help us find out, and that is, did Glover really take Britain off his project for security reasons? If so, what were those reasons?" Wilford's face froze slightly. "Obviously, Dr. Wolf, if security were involved, it is a matter I cannot discuss with you, especially over the phone. You may write me a full confidential report, and we will consider what is to be done." Wolf cut the connection in exasperation and pushed his chair away from the desk. "Well, there's a bureaucratic mind for you," he exclaimed. "He wants a problem solved and then refuses to give you the information necessary to solve the problem." Slowly he filled his thinking pipe and lit it. "The hell with them," he said finally. "We'll see this thing through ourselves. We'll have another session with Britain tomorrow and get to the bottom of the story." "I hope," Alma Heller added, "that there is a bottom to be found." As the attendants strapped Jim Britain on the table the next morning, Dr. Wolf thought how often the formula for murder repeated itself in this psychiatric age. Knock off the victim, prepare a real sick motive, and be sure you'll go to a hospital for treatment, to be released after a cure. Under these circumstances, the psychiatrist must become a detective, required to dig deep for the real motive, which generally resolved itself into the classical ones to love, hate, money. From his point of view as a doctor, any murder was a sick act, but the authorities were interested only in the legal question of whether the murderer knew what he was doing, and why. In this case, the question of the motive had a fascination to Wolf, even from a purely academic point of view. "Let's face it," he told Britain. "We both know you killed Glover. You've heard the playback of yesterday's session, so you can no longer fall back on the old excuse of, 'Everything went black, and when I came to, he was dead.' Nobody gets away with that any more." Britain maintained a sullen silence. "Just for the record," Wolf continued, "I want to fill in an important gap in the story. You told us that you sat up half the night figuring out what discovery your experiment was aiming at, but you glossed over what you actually decided at that time. Suppose we return to that night and go over the story once more in a little more detail." Britain continued his silence, and beyond a single hostile glare from beneath half-lidded eyes, gave no expression of emotion. Wolf, as he checked the connections and slipped Britain the hypodermic, was thankful that his technique did not depend upon a friendly rapport between doctor and patient. Presently Britain began to talk. "You're being taken off the project because it's become classified secret," Glover had said, and at a blow an entire year of work had been struck out from beneath Jim Britton's feet. As he sat in his room, he picked raucous chords on his guitar and allowed the anger to wash deliciously through his consciousness. Not for a minute did he believe the security classification story. He knew that the project was beginning to strike gold in an unexpected direction, and he knew what that direction was. There was a discovery in the making, A discovery so precious that for every diamond-like star out there beyond the porthole, there could be a bucket of diamonds accruing to the discoverer. And Glover was after the prophet himself, pushing Britain out of the way. This was the thought that clawed little furrows in his mind. Then, pushing their way into those little furrows came other thoughts, such as, suppose Glover should have an accident. I'd have his notebooks, and... Then he began thinking of returning to Earth, and the vision of spending a life dedicated to research in a laboratory became clouded over. Instead, there arose a picture of himself riding in an expensive car with beautiful, expensive women. He ripped a full chord out of his guitar and began to sing. In the morning, Glover stopped at Britain's breakfast table, annoyed with word of the iron source burnout. "Now how are we going to get it fixed?" he demanded in exasperation. "Gamp cut his hand yesterday. Williams had his appendix out a week ago. Langsdorff is busy with a kick sorter and—" "Why don't we do it ourselves?" Britain interrupted, eagerly. "It'll do us good to get into spacesuits again." It would do Jim Britain some good, he thought to himself. If genius was measured by the ability to spot an opportunity, then his success was assured. The plan of action was in his mind, completely formed in that instant. On the outer skin of the satellite, the two of them alone, any one of a number of accidents could occur. Holding them down against the pull of centrifugal force would be only the magnetic shoes and a thin line. From that beginning, his mind went precisely to its conclusion. "Ulmer," Morris Wolfe said, "I'm beginning to feel very uneasy. What do we have here?" He poured coffee into the cups on his desk. Ulmer Heller looked at him shrewdly and stirred sugar into her cup. "I think we have a bear by the tail," she said. "We seem to peel off layers of Jim Britton's mind, and each time there's something different underneath. Every time he tells his story there is something new and contradictory in it, and there is no clue as to whether he is getting nearer or farther from the truth." Wolfe swiveled his chair around and stared out the window onto the hospital lawn. "We thought that the deep therapy method was something perfect, something that we could make a patient tell the absolute truth as he saw it. But our patient is making hash out of it." He lifted his coffee cup and tasted the black liquid tentatively. "Follow it through. The first story he gave us was conscious. He said he couldn't remember exactly what happened to him. Okay, this could be a fabrication. The next story he gave under therapy conditions. He said that he killed Glover in a fit of rage because of an argument. Okay again. We could have accepted that at face value, and he would have gotten away with it, except that we got curious about a couple of things. We wondered how the paranoid tinge got into his thoughts, and we wondered exactly what it was that he and Glover were on the verge of discovering. So we tried again. Now we find that he deliberately plotted to kill Glover, and the paranoid symptoms are now so intense that he gives us a completely phony story about making millions of dollars out of the discovery, when everybody knows you can't patent anything for personal profit when you invent it in a government laboratory." Ulmer Heller lifted a hand, making a one with a forefinger. "So, our friend Jim Britton is doing two things, both of which we did not believe him capable of doing. First, he is lying and inventing stories under deep therapy. Second, he is withholding information. For notice that he is still avoiding specific mention of the result which his experiment was aiming at." Her voice became flat, precise, and probing. "Now, could our young physicist Jim Britton do this thing? No. Not unless he is an unsuspected Superman type. Or unless he has had special training and conditioning for resistance against deep therapy. How does a young physics student obtain such training, and where?" She looked across the desk at Morris Wolfe, who chewed savagely on his pipe bit. "If I had any sense," he growled, "I'd call up the AUC and throw Jim Britton right back in their faces. If they give me a problem to solve, they should at least tell me how hot they think it is, and my viscera are beginning to tell me that this is going to be a very, very warm baby. Maybe I should holler for help. I have a wife and 2 kids at home. I don't want to get hurt." "Who are you kidding?" Alma wanted to know. "You wouldn't let a juicy problem like this escape you just when you have it clutched about the middle. Besides, our 2 undercover friends from the FBI will be keeping their eyes on things. Let them earn their pay." "Okay," Wolf came to a decision. "We'll give it one more try, and then we'll call for help. First thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, there are 2 things I want. First, I want Britton to have a complete physical examination. The works, inside and outside. Blood tests, electroencephalograph, tissue specimens, complete x-rays, everything they can think of. Then I'll spend tonight keeping company with Britton while the technicians pull down some overtime pay analyzing the examination results." "You have an idea?" He nodded. "At least one idea, but it needs feeding." That evening, Maurice Wolfe walked down the hospital corridor past the door of Britton's room. He entered the next door and found himself in a tiny chamber already occupied by Bill Grady. This was no surprise, for he knew that Grady and Jones kept Britton under constant surveillance. He motioned for Grady to keep his seat and made himself comfortable in another chair, which he placed so that he could watch Britton through the one-way window set in the wall. Through this window he could see every move which Britton made, and through a loudspeaker he could hear every sound. It was not clear in Wolfe's mind precisely what he expected to find by watching Britton, but he knew that if he was to unravel his puzzle, he must know everything about the boy, including the way he walked and talked and combed his hair. For a time Britton sat and read, then paced the floor restlessly, as if waiting for something. Finally, he picked his guitar up from the bed and sat down on his chair, tuning the instrument. When he began to sing, it was quietly, as though to himself. Wolfe had heard him sing before, generally folk songs from the southern and midwestern states. Now there intruded into Wolfe's mind a thought which had previously been on the edge of consciousness, and simultaneously his hand reached out to touch the start button on his tape recorder. The manner in which a person sings should reveal a great deal about his early life, about the kind of language he grew up with, down to the very vocal structure which has developed in his body since childhood. As a result, there are many types of voices: French voices, Tennessee voices, Italian voices, Texas voices, each with its own flavor caused by the way in which the vocal muscles have been trained by the native language, and also by the way in which people are accustomed to singing in those places. When Wolfe went home that night, he carried a tape of Britton's song with him. It was convenient that he did not have to go far for an expert opinion to corroborate what he had already decided as an amateur. He entered his house, the pleasant place with the warm colours, the rows of books, the grand piano, and, of course, his wife. "Sorry I had to stay late, dear, but there's something important going on, something really important, and you can be a big help to me right now." "Me?" asked Lynn. "You're going back to musical therapy?" "Not exactly," he said dryly. "More like musical detection. I'm going to play a tape recording of a song or 2, and I want your professional opinion as to what part of the world the singer came from." He walked over to the recorder and began threading the tape. "Now pay no attention to the song itself," he instructed. "I'm interested only in the voice quality." The tape spool unrolled slowly, and Britton's voice filled the room. "Not bad for an amateur," Lynn commented, listening closely. For several minutes we remained silent, until finally the tape was completed. "Well," she said finally. "I don't think it's an American. A bit too rich. It doesn't have the French quality, nor the Italian. More chesty, kind of ripe and fruity. Central European, Hungarian, Russian, or something of that order." Wolf kissed her solemnly. "You win first prize, girl. That's the answer I wanted, and that's the answer that fits." Chapter 3. In the morning, the act of going to the hospital produced within him a sensation as of marching to the front line of battle. Whitehead, the laboratory chief, was prowling about his office when he arrived. "Morning," Wolf greeted him. "Got something for me?" "I have a strangeness," Whitehead said. "A very great strangeness." "We all do," Wolf replied. "What's yours?" "This Briton of yours. How old is he?" "By appearance, and according to the records, about 21. "Uh-huh. And by cellular structure and metabolism he is at least 40.
"So?"
Wolf sank down in his chair and cocked an eye at Alma Heller, who came into the room at that moment. "Did you hear that, Alma? In more ways than one, our boy isn't what he seems to be. By last night, I was certain that he is not a native of Louisville, Kentucky. Now we are told that he is twice as old as we thought he was." Alma stared for a moment. "We do seem to get in deeper and deeper. Have any ideas?" Wolf ran his hand worriedly through his hair. "One, but I'm afraid of it. At any rate, we're in too far to back out. This morning we're going to dig for more information, and we're not going to stop until we have Britain squeezed dry." He reached into his desk for his tobacco can and began filling a pipe, meanwhile organizing his thoughts. "Somehow or other," he resumed, "Britain has received conditioning to resist giving information under deep therapy." "And not only that," Alma interposed, "but he has the ability to retain consciousness under deep therapy and fabricate a story to replace the true facts."
"Correct. So since the ordinary deep therapy method is useless, we have to get tough. We have to eliminate his present set of conditioned reactions and replace them by a new set. In other words, we must reset the controls so that he responds to a new set of orders."
Alma pursed her lips for a soundless whistle. "Fisher's method. Do you know how much of that a nervous system can take?"
Wolf shrugged. "Who knows? This is very new stuff. I've played around with a little of it, but who knows? At any rate, we're going to assume that Britain has a fairly tough mind in order to get as far as he has. We'll assume that not only for his own sake, but for ours, because we are going to shake him loose from his present set of memories, and we want enough of his original memories left for us to assemble. Now suppose we begin." Whitehead excused himself. There was work waiting in his laboratory, he said, and watched wistfully as the two disappeared into the therapy room. Alma began switching on the apparatus, while Wolf called for Jim Britton to be brought in.
"Still going digging in my mind," Britton wisecracked as he walked in, flanked by the ubiquitous Grady and Jones.
"With a steam shovel," Wolf replied, and motioned that Britton be strapped onto the table. This time Wolf wasted no explanations. Without pausing, he slipped Britton a preliminary shot and began fitting electrodes onto his head and arms. "We're going back a long time now," he said quietly. "Remember back to the days before you started college. How old are you?" Britton began dreaming off.
16 years old. It was a hot summer, Kentuckian summer. Hot. Hot as a solar cycle. Hot as a bicycle down the road. A tricycle down the road. Doctor, you look like a big, pimply, warty, green-eyed toad.
Morris Wolfe waited until the drug-induced schizophrenic symptoms were well underway, then motioned for Alma Heller to send a sequence of high-frequency pulses through Britton's nervous system, breaking down synapses and destroying memory patterns.
This, in combination with the drug, was intended to clear the mind of memories involving the period of time to which Britain's attention had been directed. In this period, Wolf guessed, the conditioning had taken place. If not, then he must try another period. Britain's body stiffened under the onslaught, and perspiration rolled out on his brow. His mouth twisted, and his eyebrows writhed. Maurice Wolfe himself felt perspiration starting out on his face, while in the back of the room the two attendants stared in amazement. After enough time of this, Wolfe switched the controls so that a rhythmic pattern of pulses went through Britain's system in such a manner as to aid the triggering of synapses and the formation of memory patterns. The slate having been wiped clean, new writing had to be placed on it. "Now," he said tensely, leaning over the patient and speaking close to his ears, "cooperation means obey. Cooperation means obey. Cooperation means you do what I say. Cooperation means you do what I tell you to do, say what I tell you to say, remember what I tell you to remember. Cooperation is the key word." The words went from Wolfe's mouth to Britain's ears in the form of sound waves, were converted into neural electrical impulses, and under the influence of the rhythmically repeating pulses from the machine, circulated around and around through Britain's system, tracing a deeply etched path. Finally Wolfe ceased the talking, and Ulmer handed him the needle with the antidote to the first drug. "Now we see how successful we are," he said. He gave the shot, and several minutes went by while they waited for it to take effect. They remained silent, as though to say a word would break the spell. Then, "Cooperation," Wolfe said. Britain lay still. "Open your eyes." Britain's eyelids struggled open, but the eyes stared blankly. Wolfe thought, what question is most basic? Then he asked, "What is your name?" The mouth writhed, and then whispered, "Pyotr Ferdmineyev." There was a small roaring in Maurice Wolfe's ears, and beside him he heard the intake of Ulmer Heller's breath. The FBI agents Grady and Jones had moved up until they were leaning over Wolfe's shoulder. Then, "Where were you born?" Again the whisper from the blank face. "In Leningrad." Then, "Who sent you to America?" "The Society for the Restoration of the Revolution." "What is the nature of this organization?" "It is an underground group pledged to return the Soviet Union to its status as a leader of the world revolution and to overthrow the present appeasers of the capitalist governments." Wolfe glowed with triumph. "Get that, Ulmer," he gloated, and he turned around halfway and winked at the two men behind him. Ulmer Heller shook a strand of hair back from her eyes. "The fanatical revolutionaries. Now they're trying to overthrow their own government because the Soviet is too friendly to the Western governments." "This is no comic underground group," Wolfe said. "There are some big people in it who know how to do things that we're just barely starting to learn about." He paused and considered his next questions. The time had come to dig in. He phrased his query. "What was your task on the satellite?" Britain's face writhed. Perspiration rolled down his cheeks in a steady stream. Obviously some of the original conditioning remained, causing interference with Wolfe's orders. Ulmer Heller's knuckles showed white, and her clenched hands trembled. The FBI agents inched forward, their bodies stiff with impatience. Between hard breaths, the words came. "Was on the satellite to watch. New developments in nuclear power. Complete conversion. Matter to energy." Understanding grew in Wolf's mind with a brilliant glare. Glover had been on the verge of taming the ultimate source of energy, the total and complete conversion of matter, a source of power over 130 times more potent than the hydrogen-helium reaction. No wonder the project had been put under wraps. So you killed Glover to prevent him from continuing his work. What did you intend to gain by that? Somebody else will take it over. How are you going to develop this power source yourself? Britain groaned audibly. His back arched and his arms strained against the table straps. Through clenched teeth. Rupert! Next man in line for Glover's job. One of us. Wolf's eyes opened wide, and he whirled to the telephone. I'm calling Washington, he began, then stopped in horror. Behind him, Britain's voice said in a strangely firm tone, Now is the time. Wolf whirled again. He saw Britain, still strapped to the table, his eyes unglazed and his facial expression commanding. The FBI men had stiffened and were standing in place, motionless. Cover them and untie me, Britain rapped out, in a voice that was greatly different from the youthful, uncertain tone he had previously used. Grady pulled his gun, backed Wolf and Alma Heller against the wall, while Jones loosened Britain's straps. So you're one of them too, Grady, Wolf growled, and you, Jones, may you burn in hell. Don't malign them, said Britain, sitting up and rubbing his arms. They are good, loyal G-men, but they sat outside my door too long, and now they do what I tell them to do. Wolf narrowed his eyes and stared at Britain. Just what are you? He demanded. Britain met his gaze, bleakly, and ignored the question. We had a rendezvous to make. The two of you will escort me to a helicopter that Grady will order. I need not repeat that we are prepared to blast our way out of this place. You'll save lives all around by being as inconspicuous as possible. He indicated that Wolf and Alma Heller should go ahead, while the two agents took up the rear. Out in the main corridor, they merged into the confused traffic of the busy hospital, 2 doctors and 2 attendants conducting a patient out. Grady took the controls of the helicopter that waited for them out in the parking lot. As they climbed to a high-traffic lane, Jones took care of tying the hands of the 2 doctors behind their seats. Britain sat beside the pilot, staring through the windshield. Head due west 100 miles, he said. Then I'll give you further directions. Wolf looked down through the port next to him and felt his heart constrict as he saw the houses below grow smaller and smaller. One of those houses was his. There was a small figure beside it that could have been his little boy. That was the thought that set his heart beating violently and the adrenaline pumping swiftly through his veins. For himself, he didn't care so much, but his son needed a father to come home. He looked at Alma sitting beside him, her face pale and frightened. He wondered how much time there was before the rendezvous, for this was all the time he had. Beyond that, there were too many unknown factors to consider. He leaned over, sideways. Alma, he said in a voice not loud enough to carry forward over the roar of the motor. Tell me exactly what happened when Britain said, "Now is the time." My back was turned then. Just what did he look like? Alma swallowed. She composed her face and turned her thoughts inward, remembering. There was a sudden change, she said. One moment he was in a trance state. The next moment he was fully aware of his surroundings and in charge of the situation, as though he received a signal at that instant. A signal, Wolf thought. From where? The implication was shocking. Look at what we have, he continued to himself. Britain comes to me, under conditioning, ready to act out his part to the hilt. We question him under deep hypnotherapy, and he comes forth with a plausible story. We might have stopped right there, but we got curious and began to ask more questions. He brings out another story. Why? Obviously red herrings to confuse the issue, to stall for time. We apply more pressure, blank out his original conditioning so he gives us straight answers to questions, and we are getting along fine. Then suddenly he snaps out of it and into his original pre-Britain character, all 40 years of him. Therefore, there must have been another, deeper level to the control over his mind which we did not even touch. A level activated by a new signal which we did not even detect, a signal which came at a crucial time. Now is the time, meant that the stalling was over, that the preparations for Britain's escape were completed. There were still questions to be answered, many blank spaces to be filled in, but at the present instant there was only one question that mattered. The treatment which Wolfe had given Britain, had it been at all effective? Was it still effective? There was one way to find out. Maurice Wolfe leaned forward and called in a loud voice, "Pyotr Feminariev!" The man's head snapped around. "Cooperation is the key word," Wolfe shouted. Confusion passed over Britain's face as conflict once more knotted his nervous system. Wolfe threw his second punch immediately. "Tell Jones to cut me loose," he demanded. "Cut him loose," Britain echoed in bewilderment. After an interminable interval, Jones laid down his gun, found his knife, opened it, and slashed the cords from Wolfe's arms. Wolfe's muscles were already tensed. He snatched Jones's gun, lurched forward, and even as Britain's mouth opened to countermount his order, he slugged Britain with the butt of the pistol, hitting him viciously and hard until he lay unconscious on the floor. Then he said to Grady, "You'd better get us back to the hospital," keeping the gun in his hand. But Grady and Jones made no trouble. With Britain out of the picture, they obeyed the one obviously in command. Poor boys, Wolfe thought. Now they were in need of therapy. As the hospital hove into view, he said to all Mahela, "We have just seen the real beginning of psychological warfare, where it took us in a whole room full of equipment to condition Britain's responses to a trigger word. He was able to do it to Jones and Brady single-handed. His method is something we'd like to know. But more than that, Britain himself was conditioned to respond to a signal unknown to us and undetected by us. My God, it could only have been telepathic." All Mahela's eyes closed for a moment. "I think," she said, "that psychiatrists are going to reach the same position that physicists did during World War II. Maurice Wolfe looked dourly out of the window, watching the hospital balloon up under the helicopter. "That's the most unpleasant thing anybody has said all day," he replied. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. You know, many of these stories were written in a time where 50 years ago was in the future.